Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval Scottish Highland village, and I mean really stepping into it. Because you're about to live an entire day in a world where smoke-filled stone huts pass for luxury housing, your livestock sleep closer to you than your spouse, and the closest thing to a window is a hole in the roof that probably won't kill you with pneumonia. You can smell the peat smoke already, can't you? That acrid, earthy thickness, clinging to everything you own, everything you wear, everything you are. Here's the thing they don't mention in romanticized Highland tales. You probably won't survive your first winter here if you're arriving from our century with your delicate constitution and your expectation that shelter means protection from the elements. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. I'm always curious who's falling asleep to medieval misery at 3 in the morning versus who's using this as background for their commute. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes open to absolute darkness. Not the darkness of a modern bedroom where streetlights leak around curtains or your phone glows on the nightstand. This is the profound, disorienting black of a structure designed by people who considered windows a structural weakness and an invitation to cold death. You're lying on what your body insists is a pile of heather stuffed into rough woolen cloth. And yes, that scratching sensation against your cheek is exactly what you think it is. The mattress, if we're being generous with terminology, sits on a raised stone platform along the wall of your black house, keeping you approximately 18 inches above the dirt floor where your family's cattle are already stirring. The peat fire never truly dies. Your wife, or perhaps your mother, the darkness makes it impossible to tell, has been feeding it throughout the night, adding small chunks of that brown, compressed vegetation that defines Highland life. Historians still argue whether medieval Scottish Highlanders actually slept in shifts to maintain fires, or if the smouldering peat could genuinely last through a full night. But right now, as smoke coils through the blackness above you, the academic debate seems painfully irrelevant. The smoke has nowhere to go except up toward the hole in the roof. And up is a relative term when the ceiling is barely 6 feet high and the smoke is in no particular hurry. You know it's morning not because you can see anything you can't, but because the person sleeping next to you has started moving, their elbow connecting with your ribs in that universal spousal communication method that transcends centuries. Also, the chickens roosting in the rafters have begun their demonic screeching, which echoes beautifully in the stone chamber. Nothing says rise and shine quite like a rooster with opinions about your sleep schedule. Especially when that rooster is literally above your head and has been marinating in peat smoke all night. The cold hits you the moment you shift off the heather pile. Your body heat, combined with that of the 3 other humans sharing this sleeping platform and the half-dozen cattle below, has created a pocket of almost warmth. Beyond that pocket, the stone walls have been collecting moisture and cold all night, with the enthusiasm of a medieval dehumidifier running in reverse. The packed earth floor feels like ice against your bare feet, yes, bare, because you don't waste your one pair of leather shoes on sleeping, and you fumble for the rough woolen tunic you draped over yourself as an extra blanket. Someone has stirred the fire into reluctant life, and the first grey suggestion of dawn filters through the roof hole, mixing with smoke to create an atmosphere you could practically chew. Your black house, like every dwelling in this Highland village, is essentially a rectangle of unmortared stone, with walls 6 feet thick, a thatched roof weighted down with stones and sods, and all the weatherproofing of a motivated pile of rocks. The mainstream historical fact here is that these structures were designed for survival, not comfort. The thick walls insulated against winter storms, the low ceiling trapped heat, and the lack of windows prevented precious warmth from escaping. The quirky tidbit: these houses were called black houses, not in medieval times but centuries later, retroactively, to distinguish them from the white houses that came after structures with actual chimneys and radical innovations like walls made of mortared stone. You can hear the wind outside, whistling through the gap between the wall stones with a sound like someone gently mocking your life choices. The door, a piece of wood hung on leather hinges, because metal is for people with resources, rattles in its frame. Your eyes are adjusting now, and in the growing dimness that passes for light, you can make out shapes: the quernstone for grinding grain, the wooden buckets, the collection of tools that represents your family's entire material wealth hanging from wooden pegs. Below your sleeping platform, one of the cows lows softly, and the smell of manure mingles with peat smoke in a combination that would send modern people running for air purifiers but barely registers to you anymore. This is what home smells like. This is what survival smells like in a land where winter means months of darkness, where English lords to the south view you as barbaric cattle thieves, and where your clan's history stretches back into myth and legend with approximately the same level of documentation. Your youngest child, maybe 4 years old, is crying softly in the darkness, and you hear your wife shushing them with practiced efficiency. There's no breakfast yet. First comes the morning routine: stirring the fire properly, letting the chickens out, checking that the cattle haven't somehow died overnight. It happens. And beginning the daily negotiations with survival that define every moment of Highland life in this era. The smoke makes your eyes water as you stand fully upright, well, as upright as the ceiling allows. You've learned to move in a permanent slight crouch inside your home, a posture that future chiropractors would have strong opinions about. Outside, the village is waking. You can hear doors creaking, voices calling in Gaelic, the sound of someone's cow protesting the morning with bovine eloquence. Welcome to your life. Welcome to the dawn in a medieval Scottish Highland village, where the day begins in smoke and darkness and the promise of 18 hours of labour that might keep you alive until tomorrow's smoke-filled dawn. You crouch by the fire, your knees protesting in ways that remind you medieval life is not kind to joints, and watch as your wife begins the breakfast ritual. She's pulling out the iron pot, one of your family's most valuable possessions, inherited from her mother and probably destined to outlive you both, and filling it with water from yesterday's bucket. The water is cold enough to make your teeth ache just looking at it, drawn from the burn that runs through the village and shared with approximately 30 other families, their livestock, and whatever wildlife decided to use it as a bathroom overnight. Breakfast in a medieval Highland village isn't a meal so much as a functional necessity, like oiling a hinge or patching a leak. Your wife reaches into the wooden chest where the oats are stored, please God, let there still be oats, and produces a handful of grain that looks only slightly suspicious. The oats have been dried, stored through winter, and protected from rats with varying degrees of success. You don't ask questions about the small dark pellets mixed in with the grain. Protein is protein, and besides, they'll boil out in the cooking process, probably. The porridge begins as a thin gruel, because thick porridge requires more oats than your family can spare this early in the season. Your wife stirs the pot with a wooden paddle worn smooth by generations of stirring, and the smell of cooking oats begins to compete with the peat smoke. It's not an appetizing smell. Exactly, oats cooking in smoky water never won any culinary awards, but it's familiar, and familiarity is its own kind of comfort when comfort is in short supply. Historians still argue whether Highland Scots in this period ate primarily oats or barley, with regional and seasonal variations making any definitive answer complicated. Right now, watching the greyish porridge bubble reluctantly, you're firmly in team oats. The barley is reserved for brewing ale, because priorities exist even in subsistence agriculture, and a man who can't offer his neighbours a drink might as well move to the lowlands and start wearing English clothes. Your children are gathering around the fire now, 3 of them in various states of wakefulness and cleanliness. Cleanliness is a generous term. When water is precious, soap is a rumour, and everyone's baseline state is covered in peat smoke. The youngest is still sniffling, wiping their nose on their sleeve in a gesture that transcends both time and culture. The oldest, maybe 9 years old, is already helping organise the wooden bowls, one for each person, carved from local wood and stained dark from years of use. While the porridge cooks, you're handed a piece of yesterday's barley bread. It's hard, not a bit stale hard, but could be used as a building material hard. The mainstream historical fact is that bread in medieval Scotland was typically made from barley, oats, or a combination of both, baked into flat cakes on a griddle over the fire rather than in an oven. The quirky tidbit? This bread could last for weeks or even months when properly dried, serving as both food and emergency roof patching material. those Highland ancestors of yours wasted absolutely nothing. You tear off a piece with your teeth, which protests the effort, and let it soften in your mouth while you chew. The bread tastes like smoke, grain, and determination. There's no butter that's saved for special occasions or for trading, but your wife produces a small piece of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and you feel momentarily wealthy. The cheese is made from your own cow's milk, pressed and aged in a small wooden form, and it has that sharp, salty intensity that comes from minimal processing and maximum survival instinct. The porridge is ready when your wife decides it is, which appears to be the moment it stops being entirely liquid and achieves a consistency somewhere between soup and wallpaper paste. She ladles it into bowls with practiced efficiency, making sure the children get slightly more than the adults because growing bodies need fuel and because parental self-sacrifice is apparently a medieval value too. You receive your bowl wooden, warm to the touch, filled with greyish oat porridge that steams gently in the cold morning air. You eat with your hands and a wooden spoon, the latter being a luxury some families can't afford. The porridge is hot, bland, and filling in that way that promises to keep hunger at bay for at least a few hours. There's no salt. Salt is expensive, reserved for preserving meat, and no honey, because honey requires either keeping bees or having something valuable enough to trade for it. What you have is oats, water, and heat. Medieval fusion cuisine at its finest. Your family eats in relative silence, broken only by slurping sounds and the occasional cough from peat smoke. Conversation at breakfast is minimal because there's work to be done and daylight to use. The children finish quickly and are shooed outside to release the chickens and check on the goats. Your wife breaks off another piece of the barley bread, softening it in her porridge, a trick that makes both the bread and the porridge marginally more palatable. You scrape the bottom of your bowl with your spoon, collecting every last bit of porridge because waste is sin and hunger is certainty. The cheese goes down in small, careful bites, each one savoured because you don't know when you'll taste cheese again. Your stomach feels fuller than it is, warm porridge creating the illusion of abundance. Outside, you can hear the village coming to life. Dogs barking, voices raised in Gaelic, the sound of someone driving cattle toward the common grazing area. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. The Highland dawn is a gradual, reluctant affair, especially in winter, but work doesn't wait for convenience. Your breakfast is finished. Your stomach is no longer actively complaining. The fire is burning steadily, your wife is already cleaning the bowls with handfuls of ash and water, and the day is calling you toward labour. You stand, wiping your mouth on your sleeve, and reach for your plaid, that massive piece of woolen cloth that serves as cloak, blanket, and identity marker all at once. Time to face the cattle, the cold, and whatever this particular day has planned for you. The cattle are waiting with that patient, accusatory energy that only livestock can master. Your family owns 4 of them, small, shaggy creatures with horns that sweep outward like they're permanently surprised, and coats so long and matted they look like they're wearing fur bathrobes. These are Highland cattle before anyone thought to capitalize and trademark the name, before tourists would pay money to photograph them, when they were simply the only type of cow stubborn enough to survive in this landscape. You open the crude wooden gate that separates the sleeping platform from the lower section of your black house, and the cattle file out with dignified slowness, their hooves clicking on the packed earth floor. They've spent the night adding to the layer of manure that serves as both flooring and insulation, a detail that sounds disgusting until you realize that decomposing manure generates heat, and heat means survival. Your ancestors understood thermodynamics. They just expressed it through strategic livestock placement and a high tolerance for smell. Outside, the morning air hits like a slap from a very cold, very Scottish hand. The mist is rolling down from the hills in thick waves, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet, and turning the entire village into a ghostly collection of stone shapes and smoke trails. This is Highland weather at its most typical, damp, cold, and vaguely threatening. The sun is somewhere above the mist, theoretically, but you'll believe it when you see it. Your oldest child is already waiting with a stick, the traditional cattle herding technology that has served humanity since someone first domesticated an auroch and thought, "This seems manageable." Together, you begin walking the cattle toward the common grazing ground, a stretch of hillside that your clan shares according to rules so old and complicated that 3 different families are currently in a blood feud over interpretation details. Medieval Highland land management was nothing if not dramatic. The path winds upward through the village, past other black houses leaking smoke into the morning mist. You exchange nods with neighbours doing the same morning cattle shuffle, each family driving their small herds toward the hills. There's Angus with his 6 cattle show-off and old Moira with her 2, both looking like they might not survive another winter. The mainstream historical fact is that cattle represented wealth in medieval Highland society, serving as currency, status symbols, and targets for raids all at once. A man with 10 cattle was wealthy. A man with 20 was a minor lord. A man with none was reconsidering his life choices. Your cattle are remarkably unconcerned about the morning cold, their thick coats apparently impervious to weather that's making your fingers numb. They move at their own pace, which is somewhere between leisurely stroll and absolute refusal to acknowledge urgency. You've learned not to rush them. Rushed cattle are stubborn cattle, and stubborn cattle will plant their hooves and refuse to move until the next ice age, just on principle. The grazing ground sits on a hillside above the village, where the grass grows in thin, stubborn patches between rocks and heather. It's not lush pasture. Lush pasture doesn't exist this far north, but it's edible, and your cattle have lower standards than you do. You guide them to a spot near the cluster of rowan trees that mark the boundary between your clan's land and the disputed territory where the MacGregors graze their herds. Historians still argue whether Highland clans had clearly defined territorial boundaries or operated on a more fluid system of traditional usage rights and occasional violence. But from where you're standing, that rowan tree line looks pretty definitive. The mist is thicker up here, swirling around the cattle in a way that would be atmospheric if it weren't so wet and cold. Visibility is down to maybe 15 feet now, turning your small herd into ghostly shapes that appear and disappear as they move. You can hear other herds around you, the lowing of cattle, the shouting of herders in Gaelic, a dog barking in the distance but you can't see them. It's like herding cattle in a cloud, which is basically what you're doing. Your child taps your arm and points toward the tree line. For a moment, you see nothing, just mist and shadows. Then the shadows move. Your hand goes instinctively to the dirk at your belt, the long knife that every Highland man carries as naturally as breathing, because shadows that move in the mist are either wolves or raiders, and neither option is great for your life expectancy. The quirky tidbit that wouldn't make it into most history books. Wolves were still common in medieval Scotland, particularly in the Highlands where forest and wilderness provided cover. They were hunted, feared, and occasionally worshipped in older traditions that the church pretended didn't exist. Your great-grandfather claimed to have killed a wolf the size of a pony, but your great-grandfather also claimed to have met a selkie once, so his reliability as a witness was questionable. The shadow resolves into a deer, not a wolf, and you release the breath you were holding. The deer looks at you through the mist, decides you're not immediately threatening or edible, and bounds away up the hillside. Your heart rate returns to something approaching normal. False alarm. Just another morning in the Highlands where every shadow might be death and every sound requires investigation. You settle in to watch the cattle graze, your plaid wrapped tight against the cold, your child sitting beside you with that combination of boredom and alertness that cattle herding requires. The hours will pass slowly. The mist might lift or it might not. The cattle will eat or they won't. And somewhere in the distance, actual wolves are probably watching, calculating odds, waiting for the moment when you look away, and a calf strays too far from the herd. Just another peaceful morning tending Highland cattle in a world where nature is beautiful, brutal, and completely indifferent to your survival. You're sitting on a wet rock watching cattle eat grass when a horn sounds from the valley below. Not the cheerful toot of someone announcing dinner. This is the deep, resonant blast of a horn that means someone important wants everyone to pay attention immediately. Your cattle look up from their grazing, unimpressed. You, however, scramble to your feet because that's your clan chieftain's horn, and when the laird summons, you don't dawdle unless you're actively fond of consequences. Your child stays with the cattle someone has to, and wolves don't care about clan politics, while you start jogging down the hillside toward the village centre. Other figures are emerging from the mist, converging on the open space where the chieftain holds court, settles disputes, and occasionally reminds everyone why he's the chieftain and you're not. The social hierarchy in medieval Highland clans was absolute, unquestionable, and enforced with a combination of tradition, loyalty, and the implicit threat of being cast out into a world where lone individuals had approximately the same life expectancy as mayflies. The chieftain is already there, standing beside the stone that serves as his judgment seat. He's a tall man, your laird, with a beard that's gone grey at the edges and a presence that fills space like smoke fills your black house. He wears a plaid finer than yours, the wool tighter, the colours brighter, the whole effect screaming, "I have resources you don't," and a sword at his belt that's seen actual use in actual combat. The mainstream historical fact is that Highland clan chiefs held near absolute authority over their territories and kinsmen, functioning as judge, war leader, landlord, and patriarch all at once. They weren't elected and they couldn't be fired. They inherited their position through bloodlines that supposedly traced back to ancient Celtic kings and possibly, if you believed the bards, to gods. You join the growing crowd of villagers, perhaps 40 people total, representing every family in this particular pocket of the Highlands. There's Angus with his 6 cattle, old Moira wrapped in a threadbare plaid, the blacksmith with his permanently ash-stained hands, and various children who've been dragged along because childcare wasn't a medieval concept that had been invented yet. Everyone is silent, waiting. You don't interrupt your chieftain. You don't even cough too loudly if you can help it. The laird begins speaking in Gaelic English, is for lowlanders and English lords, neither of whom are present or welcome, and his voice carries across the gathering with practiced authority. The issue at hand is grazing rights. Specifically, the MacGregors from the next valley have been moving their boundary markers, pushing into what your clan considers its traditional territory. Those rowan trees you were noticing earlier? Apparently the MacGregors have been cutting some down and planting new ones 50 yards further into your clan's land, which is either admirably bold or suicidally stupid depending on your perspective. Your chieftain is not pleased. You can tell because his hand keeps drifting to his sword hilt, and when a Highland clan chief starts unconsciously touching his weapon, it generally means someone is about to have a very bad day. He's outlining the situation with the kind of detail that suggests he's been personally inspecting the boundary, counting trees, measuring distances, and working himself into a controlled fury that's somehow more terrifying than explosive anger. The quirky tidbit that anthropologists love. Highland clan territories weren't marked with fences or walls, but with natural features, streams, distinctive rocks, specific trees that everyone simply knew were boundaries. Except everyone's knowledge was based on oral tradition, family stories, and possibly some creative interpretation, which meant border disputes were both constant and impossible to resolve with anything resembling objective evidence. Your great-grandfather said the boundary was here. Their great-grandfather said it was there. Now it's a blood feud waiting to happen. The laird is calling for volunteers. Not volunteers to negotiate or survey or have a polite discussion with the MacGregors volunteers to join a retaliatory cattle raid. This is how property disputes are settled in the medieval Highlands. You steal their cattle, they steal yours, eventually everyone loses count, and the whole thing becomes a tradition that lasts for generations. You're watching neighbours raise their hands, younger men eager to prove themselves, older men who know this is a bad idea but can't back down without looking weak. Historians still argue whether Highland cattle raiding was primarily economic necessity, stealing cattle because you needed them, or social performance, a way for clans to demonstrate strength and maintain honour in a culture where reputation meant everything. Right now, watching your chieftain's eyes gleam with anticipation of organised theft, you're thinking it's probably 60% honour, 30% economics, and 10% the fact that Highland winters are long and boring, and raiding at least provides entertainment. You don't volunteer. You have 4 cattle, a family to feed, and a strong survival instinct that says getting stabbed by a MacGregor over some disputed trees is a poor return on investment. The laird doesn't seem to notice or care he has enough volunteers already, young men practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of legal cattle theft blessed by clan authority. But then the chieftain's gaze sweeps the crowd and lands on you. Your stomach drops. He's saying your name now, asking about your cattle. whether you've seen McGregor herds crossing the boundary. You answer carefully, truthfully, because lying to your chieftain is a express route to exile or worse. Yes, you've seen cattle near the rowan trees. No, you couldn't swear they were McGregor cattle specifically. All cattle look basically the same in the mist, and you were more concerned about wolves than territorial politics. The laird accepts this with a nod. He's moving on to other business now, a dispute between two families over a broken betrothal contract, a complaint about someone's pig destroying someone else's kale patch. The usual tedious bureaucracy of keeping 40 families functioning without killing each other. You're free to go, dismissed with a gesture, and you're already backing away from the gathering before he changes his mind and decides he needs your cattle for the raid after all. Walking back up the hillside toward your child and your grazing herd, you reflect on the peculiar nature of Highland clan governance. Your chieftain controls everything: where you graze, who you marry, whether you go to war, how disputes are settled, even which version of family history becomes official truth. He's landlord, judge, general, and father figure, and questioning his authority is approximately as wise as questioning gravity, technically possible, but practically inadvisable. This is your world. This is how society functions when you're days away from any other authority, when royal justice is a theoretical concept from the distant lowlands, when your laird's word is literally the only law that matters. You reach your child, who asks what the horn was about. You explain about the McGregors, the trees, the coming raid. Your child nods, unsurprised. This is normal. This is life. The cattle keep grazing, indifferent to clan politics and boundary disputes. Smart cattle. By midday, you've left your child to watch the cattle. They're old enough now. And besides, what's the worst that could happen besides wolves, raiders, or livestock deciding to wander into disputed McGregor territory and return to the village where the real work is happening? Not that herding cattle isn't work, but it's the kind of work that involves a lot of sitting and watching, weaving and spinning. That's the kind of work that never, ever stops, that follows women from childhood to grave, that produces literally every piece of cloth your family owns. Your wife is outside the black house with 3 other women, all of them seated on low stools arranged in a rough circle. The spindles are already moving, which means they started hours ago, probably before you finished your porridge. In the center of their circle is a basket of raw fleece wool sheared from your sheep last spring, washed in the burn until your arms felt like they'd fall off, dried in whatever sunlight the Highlands reluctantly provided, and now waiting to be transformed into something useful. Spinning wool is one of those activities that looks meditative and peaceful until you actually try it, at which point you discover it requires the hand-eye coordination of a juggler, the patience of a saint, and the ability to maintain constant tension on thread that wants to break every time you breathe wrong. Your wife's hands move with practiced efficiency, pulling fleece from the mass in her lap, twisting it between her fingers, feeding it onto the drop spindle that dangles and rotates below her hand. The spindle is just a wooden stick with a weight at the bottom, a hole made from stone or clay, but in skilled hands, it becomes a thread-producing machine that would impress even our modern textile factories if we could slow down and pay attention. The mainstream historical fact here is that spinning and weaving were exclusively women's work in medieval Highland society, occupying essentially all of women's time that wasn't dedicated to cooking, child-rearing, or agricultural labor. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every bag and belt and band of cloth came from women's hands, from sheep to thread to fabric in a process that took hundreds of hours per garment. The quirky tidbit? The word spinster originally just meant a woman who spins, a neutral job description before it evolved into a term for unmarried women, because spinning was so universal among women that it became synonymous with womanhood itself. The women are talking as they work, because humans can't sit in circles making thread for hours without conversation and still maintain sanity. Your wife is describing this morning's clan gathering. Embellishing the details slightly was the chieftain's beard really bristling with fury. Or are we taking creative liberties? While the other women nod and spin and add their own commentary. Old Moira, who's probably 70 if she's a day, and has the kind of weathered face that suggests she's been personally insulted by every winter of her life, is offering her opinion on the McGregor situation. with language that would make a sailor reassess his vocabulary choices. The conversation shifts to more interesting territory. Who's pregnant? Who should be pregnant? Who definitely isn't pregnant despite being married for 2 years now, which is basically a scandal. Medieval Highland women apparently invented gossip, or at least perfected it to an art form that involved tracking every pregnancy, betrothal, dispute, and rumour within a 5-mile radius. Someone's daughter was seen talking to a MacLeod boy at the last gathering. The horror, the implications, the potential political ramifications if that develops into actual romance. Your wife's thread breaks. She sighs, ties the ends back together with a knot that will create a small lump in the eventual fabric, and keeps spinning. Breaking thread is normal. Breaking thread is expected. Breaking thread is what happens when you're trying to transform a cloud of fleece into something strong enough to be woven, and honestly, the fact that it works at all feels like a minor miracle involving physics principles that won't be formally described for another few centuries. Beside the spinners, another woman is working at a small loom, a simple frame of wood, with threads stretched vertically, held tight by stone weights at the bottom. She's weaving horizontal threads through the vertical ones, in an over-under pattern so basic that children learn it, yet so effective that humanity has been using basically the same technique since we figured out that fabric was superior to animal skins for most purposes. Her shuttle moves back and forth with rhythmic precision, each pass adding another thin line to the growing cloth. Historians still argue whether Highland looms were primarily vertical warp-weighted looms like this one, or horizontal ground looms, with regional variations and time periods making definitive answers complicated. What's certain is that the fabric emerging from this loom is rough, thick, and exactly suited for Highland life, weatherproof, durable, and capable of being dyed with local plants into colours ranging from muddy brown to slightly less muddy brown, with occasional excursions into greyish brown for special occasions. The women are sharing herbal knowledge now, swapping remedies with the kind of medical authority that comes from generations of trial, error, and probably some unfortunate deaths that get quietly forgotten in the retelling. Someone's child has a cough. Try an infusion of coltsfoot, boiled in water and sweetened with honey if you can get it, though honestly, just the hot water and steam probably helps more than the plant. Someone else has joint pain. Wear a copper bracelet, says old Moira, because copper definitely has medicinal properties, and not because someone once wore copper and their joint pain coincidentally improved around the same time. Your wife mentions the poultice you used last winter for that infected cut on your hand, a mixture of crushed yarrow, moss, and possibly some spider webs, because medieval Highland medicine was nothing if not creative. The other women nod knowingly. Yarrow is good, moss is traditional. Spider webs actually do have antibacterial properties, though your ancestors didn't know about bacteria and just noticed that putting spider webs on wounds seemed to work better than not putting spider webs on wounds. The spinning continues, thread accumulating on spindles that will eventually be wound into balls, measured and set aside for weaving. The loom grows slowly, one pass at a time, creating cloth that might become a new tunic, a blanket, or trading material if you're desperate enough. This is wealth being created from literally nothing but sheep, skill, and time. This is how your family stays clothed. This is how you survive winters when survival isn't guaranteed. You watch for a moment longer, grateful that your gender exempts you from this particular form of tedious labour. Then head toward the blacksmith's forge, where at least the work involves hitting things with hammers instead of maintaining perfect tension on fragile thread for hours at a time. The sun has reached its highest point, which in Highland terms means the mist has temporarily thinned to a state where you can see maybe 100 feet instead of 20. This counts as good weather, and you're taking the optimism where you can find it. Your stomach is making opinions known about the breakfast porridge, having worn off approximately 2 hours ago, and the midday meal is calling you back to the Black House with the urgency of biological necessity. Inside, your wife has already started preparing what passes for lunch in a medieval Highland household. The iron pot is back over the fire, filled with water that's heating slowly because peat fires are many things, but rapidly responsive to cooking needs isn't one of them. She's chopping kale on a wooden board, The knife, another precious iron possession, making rhythmic, thunking sounds as it reduces the tough leaves into manageable pieces. Kale, always kale. The mainstream historical fact is that kale was one of the few vegetables that could reliably survive highland growing conditions, tolerating cold, poor soil, and general atmospheric hostility with the determination of a plant that refuses to accept defeat. Your ancestors didn't eat kale because it was trendy or because someone told them it was a superfood. They ate it because it was there, it grew, and dying of scurvy was even less appealing than eating bitter green leaves for the 1,000th consecutive meal. Into the pot goes the kale, followed by chunks of turnip that have been living in a storage pit beneath the black house floor. The turnips are wrinkled, slightly soft, and probably wouldn't pass any modern food safety inspection, but they're edible, and that's really the only criterion that matters. Turnips joined kale in the vegetables that don't immediately die in Scottish weather category, making them dietary staples whether you like them or not. Spoiler, nobody particularly liked them, but hunger is an excellent seasoning. Your wife is also unwrapping a piece of salted fish from its cloth covering, and the smell hits you immediately: salt, fish, and that particular aroma that says this protein has been preserved through sheer determination and enough salt to desiccate a whale. The fish is probably cod or haddock, caught somewhere on the coast and traded inland, where it's been hanging in your black house rafters for weeks or possibly months, slowly drying and absorbing peat smoke until it has roughly the texture of leather and approximately the same flavor profile. She breaks off a piece of the fish. It requires actual effort, like snapping a stick, and adds it to the pot. The quirky tidbit that food historians love. Salted fish was often so dry and tough that it had to be soaked in water overnight before cooking, or beaten with a hammer to break down the fibers. Your wife is going with the boil it until it surrenders approach, which is quicker if less effective. Medieval Highland cuisine was nothing if not pragmatic. The children are already gathering around the fire, drawn by the smell of cooking food and the universal child ability to appear exactly when meals are happening. Your oldest has returned from the cattle, leaving them in your second child's questionable care, because the prospect of food outweighs the slight risk of livestock-related disaster. Everyone is hungry. Everyone is always hungry. The morning porridge was hours ago, and physical labor burns calories with impressive efficiency. The pot bubbles reluctantly, kale and turnips softening in the hot water, while the salted fish releases its salt into the broth, creating a soup that's basically ocean-flavored vegetable water with chunks. There's no bread today. Yesterday's barley cake was the last of this week's baking, which means this soup-stew hybrid is the entire meal. You're trying not to think about how monotonous the diet is, how you've eaten variations of kale and turnips for literally your entire life, how you'll probably eat variations of kale and turnips until the day you die, or someone invents potatoes and revolutionizes Highland agriculture. Historians still argue whether medieval Highland diets included more variety than the documented staples suggest, with occasional additions of game, berries, mushrooms, and other foraged foods supplementing the agricultural basics. From where you're sitting, watching kale boil in salted water, the scholarly debate feels academic. Maybe wealthy clan chiefs ate venison and imported spices. You eat kale. Your wife ladles the stew into wooden bowls, the same bowls you used for breakfast, now rinsed with water and ash and ready for round two. There are no individual portions measured with precision. She eyeballs it, making sure the children get slightly more than adults because growing bodies need fuel, even if that fuel is primarily leafy vegetables and questionable fish. The bowls are passed around the fire, each person receiving their share with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of practice. You eat with your hands and a wooden spoon, fishing out chunks of turnip and kale and fish, drinking the broth directly from the bowl when the solids are gone. The food is hot, salty, and filling in that temporary way that vegetables provide. The fish adds protein and a complexity to the flavor that boiled kale desperately needs, even if that complexity is mostly salt, with notes of more salt and hints of smoke, because everything in your life tastes like smoke. The meal happens in relative silence, because talking interferes with eating, and eating is the priority. Your youngest child makes a face at the turnip. Some things transcend time periods, including children's opinions about root vegetables, but eats it anyway because the alternative is going hungry, and hunger is a powerful motivator. Old Moira has joined you, bringing her own bowl to contribute to the communal pot, because Highland meal sharing extended beyond immediate family when food was available. She's telling a story between mouthfuls, something about a selkie she saw at the coast 40 years ago, and everyone nods politely because you don't interrupt your elders, even when their stories involve mythological seal people with dubious basis in reality. The story meanders through various supernatural encounters, fairies at the crossroads, a water horse in the loch, a ghost that turned out to be someone's laundry drying in the moonlight, while the kale stew gradually disappears into hungry bellies. You scrape your bowl clean, drinking the last of the salty broth, and your stomach feels marginally less empty than it did 20 minutes ago. This is success. This is lunch in a medieval Highland village. Kale, turnips, salted fish, and enough calories to keep working until the evening meal brings more of the same with slight variations. Your taste buds are bored. Your stomach is grateful. The afternoon's labor is calling, and you're fueled enough to answer. The children scatter after lunch like birds startled by a hunting dog. But they're not fleeing toward leisure, they're fleeing toward different kinds of work. Because childhood in a medieval Highland village is essentially an extended apprenticeship in survival skills, with occasional breaks for activities that might generously be called play. Your youngest, the 4-year-old who was crying at dawn, is already being assigned their first real task, watching the geese. The geese are kept in a communal flock that wanders through the village like a gang of feathered terrorists, honking opinions about everything and attacking anyone who looks at them wrong. Someone has to watch them, make sure they don't wander into the kale patches or get eaten by foxes, and that someone is traditionally whatever child is old enough to walk but too young for harder labor. Your youngest accepts this responsibility with the solemn gravity of someone being entrusted with their first real job, taking up a small stick, the universal child labor tool, and heading toward the gaggle of geese that are currently terrorizing someone's chickens. Geese, you reflect, are useful animals. They eat grass and insects. They lay eggs occasionally. They make excellent alarm systems because they honk at literally everything. And at Christmas or special feast days, they become dinner. The mainstream historical fact is that geese were common in medieval Highland communities, specifically because they required minimal care, could forage for themselves, and provided both eggs and meat. The quirky tidbit that always amuses you: geese were also valued as living sentries because their aggressive territoriality and loud honking made them better watchdogs than actual dogs in some circumstances. Your middle child, maybe 7 years old, has been dispatched to fetch water, the eternal task that never ends, because humans need water constantly and the burn is always inconveniently far away. They're struggling with a wooden bucket that's almost as tall as they are, walking with the concentrated focus of someone who knows that spilling water means making another trip, and another trip means less time for whatever brief moments of freedom childhood allows. You watch them navigate the muddy path toward the burn, joining 3 other children on similar missions. Water fetching is a social activity out of necessity. The walk is long enough to get boring and dangerous. Enough slippery rocks, swift current, occasional wolves, that children travel in groups. They'll fill their buckets, attempt to carry them back without losing too much to splashing, and probably end up covered in mud and water before returning home to do it again tomorrow. Your oldest child is with the cattle again, because 9 years old is practically adult in Highland years, and cattle herding is considered appropriate work for someone who's demonstrated they can be trusted not to let the family's wealth wander into McGregor territory. In a few years, they'll be learning more specialized skills your son might apprentice with the blacksmith, or learn proper weapon handling from your clan's warriors. Your daughter might begin serious weaving and spinning training. For now, cattle are their world, but it's not all work. Between the water fetching and goose herding and cattle watching, there are moments when the children of the village congregate in the muddy center area between the black houses and create entertainment from absolutely nothing. You can see them now, a group of 6 or 7 children, ranging from maybe 5 to 10 years old, engaged in some game that involves stones and sticks, and rules that apparently make sense to them, even if adult observation suggests pure chaos. One popular game involves throwing stones at a mark, a piece of wood stuck in the mud about 10 paces away, with the winner being whoever hits it most consistently. This teaches hand-eye coordination, competitiveness, and the valuable life skill of throwing rocks at things, which will come in handy if they ever need to drive off raiders, hunt small game, or just impress their peers with their rock-throwing prowess. Historians still argue whether medieval children's games were primarily educational, deliberately teaching practical skills through play, or simply children being children and adults retroactively assigning educational value to what was, essentially, throwing rocks because rocks are there. Another game involves a circle drawn in the mud and a stick that gets passed around while everyone chants something in Gaelic that might be an ancient rhyme or might be complete nonsense. With children, it's genuinely hard to tell. When the chanting stops, whoever holds the stick has to run to the far side of the village and back before the others can tag them. It's basically tag with extra steps and a stick, but the children are treating it with the seriousness of Olympic competition. Your youngest has abandoned the geese temporarily. They're fine, probably to join a group building something in the mud. Calling it building might be generous. It looks more like piling mud into increasingly unstable towers. But they're fully engaged, their hands covered in cold muck, their faces intense with concentration. This is castle building or house building, or possibly just making mud exist in vertical shapes without any particular goal beyond the joy of manipulating matter. The children are speaking Gaelic to each other, naturally, because English is for lowlanders and formal occasions, and definitely not for casual play. Their voices rise and fall in that particular cadence. Children have high-pitched, rapid fire, occasionally dissolving into laughter or argument. Someone's older brother is teaching the younger ones a crude rhyme about the MacGregors that involves unflattering comparisons to livestock, and the younger ones are repeating it with the delighted shock of children learning forbidden words. A girl around 8 years old is demonstrating a game with String Cat's Cradle, though that name won't exist for centuries, creating intricate patterns between her fingers and passing them to another child who attempts to transform them without dropping the loops. It's mesmerizing to watch, actually, the way the string creates geometry from simple movements. And you wonder briefly who invented this game and how it's spread across cultures without anyone writing it down. The children's play is brief, maybe 30 minutes stolen between chores before responsibilities call them back. The geese are wandering too far, the water buckets need refilling, the cattle need checking. But for these moments, they're just children, playing in mud with sticks and stones, creating joy from nothing in a world that offers little enough of it. You remember being that age. Remember these same games or variations of them. Remember the brief freedom between morning work and afternoon work, when the world was slightly less focused on survival and slightly more focused on whether you could throw a rock farther than Angus's son. Some things don't change, even across generations, even in a life defined by labor. The children scatter again, back to their respective duties, leaving the muddy village centre marked with footprints, discarded sticks, and the fading echoes of laughter. The blacksmith's forge sits at the edge of the village, strategically positioned downwind so the smoke and sparks don't add to everyone's existing smoke and spark problems. You can hear the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal before you see the smithy itself, a sound that carries across the village like a heartbeat, irregular but constant, the percussion track to Highland life. The forge is essentially a stone hearth built chest-high, currently glowing with coals so hot they're gone past red to that white-orange colour that suggests touching them would be a brief and regretful experience. The blacksmith, a man named Duncan, whose forearms look like they were carved from the same material he's working with, is pumping the bellows with one hand while holding tongs with the other, bringing a piece of iron to the precise temperature where it becomes malleable enough to reshape, but not so hot it turns to slag. You're here because your ploughshare is broken. Well, broken is generous, it's cracked, bent, and generally expressing the metal equivalent of, I've had enough of Highland soil and would like to retire now. The ploughshare is literally the business end of your plough, the iron blade that cuts through soil and makes agriculture possible, and without it, you're basically trying to farm with a pointed stick like some kind of Bronze Age peasant. So yes, you need the blacksmith. And yes, you'll wait as long as necessary. because Duncan is the only person within 20 miles who can convince metal to do things metal doesn't naturally want to do. The mainstream historical fact is that blacksmiths held special status in medieval Highland society, occupying a position somewhere between tradesman and magician. They were essential to community survival making and repairing tools, weapons, horseshoes, cooking implements, and basically anything that required metal. Yet they worked with fire and transformation in ways that seemed almost supernatural to people who didn't understand metallurgy. A village without a blacksmith was a village slowly dying as its metal implements degraded beyond use. Duncan acknowledges your presence with a grunt, which is blacksmith for, "I see you, and I'll get to you when I finish this piece that's currently at exactly the right temperature and can't wait." You nod understanding and settle in to watch. Because watching a skilled craftsman work is genuinely fascinating if you have the patience for it, which you'd better have because Duncan works at Duncan's pace, and rushing him is like rushing the weather, pointless and likely to make things worse. He's currently working on a horseshoe, heating and hammering the iron into a curved shape that will eventually protect some horse's hoof from the rocky Highland paths. Each hammer blow is precise, controlled, landing exactly where Duncan intends, with a force that seems casual, but is probably the result of decades of practice. The iron glows, sparks fly with each strike, and gradually, so gradually, you almost don't notice, the straight bar becomes curved, the curve becomes refined, and the refined curve becomes something you'd recognize as a horseshoe. The quirky tidbit that fascinates you every time you think about it. The techniques Duncan is using right now, heating iron in a charcoal fire, hammering it while hot, quenching it in water to harden, are essentially unchanged since Roman times and possibly earlier. The basic technology of blacksmithing was so effective that humanity just kept using it for centuries with minimal modification. Your ancestors were working iron the same way Duncan is working it now, and their ancestors before them, stretching back into a past where everything is mythology and questionable genealogies. Duncan quenches the horseshoe in a bucket of water, creating a violent hiss and a cloud of steam that smells like hot metal and minerals. He examines it critically, finds some flaw invisible to your untrained eye, and puts it back in the forge for another heating cycle. Perfection takes time. Perfection also takes iron. And iron is expensive enough that you can't afford to waste it on sloppy work. The forge itself is a marvel of functional design. The stone hearth contains the fire while reflecting heat outward. The bellows force air into the coals to raise the temperature far beyond what a natural fire could achieve, and the anvil provides a hard, stable surface for hammering that won't crack or deform under repeated impacts. These are tools that represent serious investment. The anvil alone probably cost more than your entire year's agricultural output, but they're also tools that will last generations if properly maintained. You're watching Duncan's face as he works, and you notice something that probably doesn't make it into romantic ballads about noble craftsmen. He's sweating profusely despite the cold Highland air. His face is smudged with ash and soot, and he's squinting against the forge's glare with an expression that suggests he's having approximately as much fun as you do pulling turnips. Skilled labor is still labor. Respected work is still work. The fact that Duncan can do things you can't doesn't mean he enjoys every moment of doing them. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths were primarily generalists, able to make and repair any iron item, or whether specialization existed, with some smiths focusing on tools, others on weapons, others on decorative work. Duncan appears to be firmly in the generalist camp, because you've seen him make everything from cooking pots to swords to the iron bands that hold wooden buckets together. Specialization is a luxury for societies with enough blacksmiths that people can afford to pick favorites. You have Duncan. Duncan does everything. This is the arrangement. He finally finishes the horseshoe, sets it aside to cool, and turns his attention to your plowshare. You hand it over with the reverence of someone passing a holy relic to a priest, because in agricultural terms, that's basically what this is. Duncan examines it, running his fingers along the crack, checking the bend, making small, disapproving noises that suggest your plowshare has disappointed him personally. "Hit a rock?" he asks in Gaelic, because obviously you hit a rock. Everyone hits rocks. The Highland soil, is approximately 60% rocks by volume, and plowshares hit them with the inevitability of sunrise. You confirm that yes, you hit a rock. A big one, hidden under what looked like perfectly innocent soil until your plow found it with the unerring accuracy of Murphy's Law. Duncan nods, unsurprised, and begins heating the plowshare in his forge. The repair will take time. Iron needs to be heated, hammered back into shape, possibly welded if the crack is bad enough, then carefully cooled to maintain proper hardness. You're looking at maybe an hour of work, which translates to a debt you'll repay in labour, trade goods, or possibly letting Duncan graze his goats on your land when his own pasture is overgrazed. Money exists in medieval Scotland, theoretically, but in your village, the economy runs on barter, mutual obligation, and complex networks of favours owed and repaid. Duncan fixes your ploughshare. You help him harvest his barley. The weaver makes you a new tunic. You give her eggs from your chickens. Everyone owes everyone else something, and the whole system functions through trust and the knowledge that you'll all see each other tomorrow and the day after and for the rest of your lives. The forge radiates heat like a small, localized sun, and you're grateful for it because the afternoon has turned cold and damp in that way that suggests rain is coming. Duncan works steadily, methodically, transforming your damaged ploughshare back into something functional through the application of heat, force, and expertise. This is how civilization survives. This is how agriculture continues. This is how a village full of people who individually can't make metal tools collectively maintains the metal tools they need to not starve. You watch, wait, and reflect that there's something profound about the simplicity of it all. Man, metal, fire, hammer. The same elements, the same process, stretching back through time until history blurs into legend. Your ploughshare is repaired, or at least functional enough that Duncan is willing to hand it back with his professional blessing, and you're heading home with the iron blade tucked under your arm when you remember that the water buckets are nearly empty, and the peat stack beside the fire has dwindled to a concerning level. Which means your afternoon is about to become an exercise in hauling heavy things from inconvenient locations, also known as every afternoon in medieval Highland life. The water situation is critical because humans need water for literally everything: drinking, cooking, washing, occasionally, and maintaining the baseline level of not dying of dehydration that modern people take for granted. Your black house has no plumbing, no indoor water source, no magical tap that produces clean water at the turn of a handle. What you have is the burn, a stream that runs through the valley about 200 yards from your door, fed by Highland rainfall and snowmelt and probably some underground springs that nobody's ever bothered to investigate because water comes from the burn is explanation enough. You grab 2 wooden buckets, they're never just one bucket. Because making one trip is for optimists and people who haven't learned that efficiency means carrying as much as your spine can handle and start walking toward the burn. The path is muddy, naturally, because Highland paths exist in a permanent state of recently rained on or about to be rained on, with occasional brief periods of currently raining. The burn itself is maybe 15 feet wide at this point, flowing over rocks with that cheerful bubbling sound that would be pleasant if you were a tourist, appreciating nature instead of someone about to haul 40 pounds of water uphill. The water is clear, cold enough to make your teeth ache, and supposedly clean, though clean is relative when you consider that 30 families upstream are using this same burn for everything from drinking water to washing clothes to occasionally bathing when social pressure or lice populations demand. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Highland communities relied entirely on natural water sources, streams, springs, wells, if they were fortunate, with no concept of water treatment or purification beyond moving water, is probably safer than standing water. The quirky tidbit that public health historians find alarming. People drank directly from the same water sources where animals waded, where waste runoff collected, and where upstream communities disposed of various unpleasant things, yet somehow survived long enough to produce descendants. The human immune system was apparently more robust when it had no choice in the matter. You kneel at the bank, dip the first bucket into the current, and feel the immediate weight as water floods in. Wood and water combine to create something substantially heavier than either component alone, And you're reminded that physics doesn't care about your back problems or your desire to not spend the afternoon doing manual labor. The first bucket comes up full, sloshing slightly, and you set it carefully on the bank before filling the second. 2 buckets, maybe 5 gallons total, weighing approximately 40 pounds combined. The walk back to your black house is uphill. Gentle uphill, admittedly, but uphill is still uphill when you're carrying liquid weight that sloshes with every step and threatens to splash down your legs if you walk too quickly or stumble on the inevitable rocks that populate every Highland path. You're halfway home when you pass your middle child coming down for another load, their smaller bucket making the trip seem even more endless. They'll make 3 trips to your 2, carrying less each time, building the strength and endurance that will eventually let them carry full adult loads. This is childhood education, Highland style, less reading and writing, and more developing the muscles necessary to haul resources from nature before nature kills you. The buckets reach your black house with maybe 80% of their original water intact, the rest having sloshed out during transit in a demonstration of why spillage is factored into the process. Your wife takes them, pours the water into the large storage container, a wooden barrel that leaks slightly but less than the alternatives, and you're immediately heading back down for another round because 2 buckets is barely enough for cooking, drinking, and maintaining basic hydration for a family of 5 plus assorted livestock. Historians still argue whether medieval people drank primarily water or whether they consumed mostly ale and milk because water was considered unsafe. From your perspective, making multiple trips to the burn daily, people drank whatever was available, which was mostly water because brewing ale required grain you might need for eating, and keeping enough dairy animals to supply everyone with milk was a luxury most families couldn't afford. 3 trips to the burn later, your shoulders are protesting and the afternoon is advancing toward evening with concerning speed. But the water situation is temporarily solved, which means you can move on to the other essential resource that requires hauling, peat. The peat bog lies beyond the village in the opposite direction from the burn, because of course it does. Locating essential resources conveniently close together would violate some unwritten rule of Highland geography. Peat is fossilized plant matter, compressed over centuries in waterlogged bogs until it becomes a brown, spongy material that burns slowly and produces the distinctive smoke that defines every Highland home. Without peat, you freeze. Without peat, you can't cook. Without peat, you're basically choosing to experience hypothermia as a lifestyle. You're carrying a spade iron blade, wooden handle, sharpened from years of cutting into bog, and heading toward the communal peat bank where your clan has extraction rights. Peat cutting is seasonal work, traditionally done in spring when the ground is soft but not waterlogged. But maintenance cutting happens year-round because the fire never stops, and neither does fuel consumption. The bog squelches under your feet, waterlogged soil giving way with each step, releasing that distinctive peaty smell, earthy, organic, ancient. You find the section where you've been cutting, marked by the vertical face where previous extractions have exposed layers of compressed vegetation dating back possibly thousands of years. The mainstream historical fact is that peat cutting was communal labor in Highland society, with families working together to extract, dry, and store fuel for the coming year. The quirky tidbit? The peat your ancestors burned might contain pollen from plants that grew when Romans occupied Britain, making your heating fuel also an inadvertent archaeological record. You drive the spade into the peat face, cutting rectangular blocks about the size of bread loaves. Each cut requires force. Peat is dense, resistant, waterlogged, and you're leveraging your entire body weight to pry each block free. The blocks come out wet, heavy, nearly black, and completely useless for burning until they've dried for months in whatever sun the Highlands reluctantly provide. But you also maintain a supply of dried peat from last year's cutting, stacked under a crude shelter near your black house. And it's from this stack that you'll replenish today's fuel. You load maybe 20 blocks into a woven basket, hoist it onto your back, and start the walk home with approximately 50 pounds of fossilized plant matter digging into your shoulders. This is your afternoon. Water from the burn, peat from the bog, both requiring multiple trips, both essential for survival, both back-breaking in that literal way, where your back actually hurts and will continue hurting tomorrow and the next day and forever until you die or develop calluses so thick they qualify as additional vertebrae. You reach your black house, dump the peat beside the fire, and your wife is already feeding blocks into the flames. The cycle continues. Cut, carry, burn, repeat. Tomorrow you'll do it again. And the day after. And the day after that. Until the seasons change and different forms of exhausting labor replace the current forms. Your back aches. Your shoulders burn. Your hands are raw from bucket handles and spade grips. This is normal. This is life. This is the price of warmth and water, in a world that provides neither without demanding physical payment. You're stacking the last of the peat blocks when you hear the commotion voices raised in what might be excitement or alarm. It's genuinely hard to tell, with Gaelic shouting, and then someone's running through the village announcing that the priest has arrived. Not a priest, but the priest, Father Callum, who travels a circuit of maybe 6 villages and shows up in yours approximately once every 3 weeks if the weather cooperates and he hasn't been waylaid by illness, raiders, or general misfortune. The announcement sends everyone into motion because when the priest comes, you attend Mass, whether you're particularly devout or just don't want to be the family that gets judged for skipping out on religious obligations. You're wiping peat dust off your hands and heading toward the largest black house in the village, the one belonging to your clan chieftain, where religious services happen, because building a dedicated church would require resources nobody has and architectural ambitions that seem excessive for a village of 40 souls. Father Callum is already there, looking damp and exhausted in the way of someone who's walked maybe 10 miles through Highland weather today and will walk 10 more tomorrow. He's younger than you expected, maybe 30, with the kind of lean build that suggests frequent meals are more aspiration than reality. His robes are muddy at the hem, patched at the elbows, and he's carrying a small wooden chest that contains whatever liturgical items are required for conducting Mass in remote locations where religious infrastructure consists of the priest showed up. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval Catholic Church's reach into the Scottish Highlands was tenuous at best, with scattered communities served by travelling priests who might visit monthly or even less frequently. These priests were often poorly educated, barely literate, and operating in a region where older Celtic Christianity had blended with pre-Christian beliefs in ways that made Orthodox Catholicism more of a suggestion than a rule. The quirky tidbit that church historians find fascinating: Highland priests often conducted Mass in Gaelic rather than Latin, technically violating church protocol, but practically necessary when your congregation speaks Gaelic exclusively and wouldn't understand Latin if their souls depended on it, which, theologically speaking, they might. The chieftain's black house is crowded. Your entire village is cramming into a space designed for maybe 15 people, creating a density of bodies that would violate multiple modern fire codes if fire codes were a concept that existed. Everyone's standing because there aren't enough seats, and also because standing during Mass is traditional, respectful, and prevents anyone from getting too comfortable during religious instruction. Father Callum opens his wooden chest and produces items that look disproportionately fancy compared to their surroundings. A small silver cup, a piece of cloth that might once have been white, a wooden cross with actual carved details. These are the portable symbols of Catholic authority, and their presence transforms this smoky black house into something resembling a church if you squint and have faith, and don't think too hard about the cattle living 10 feet below you. The priest begins speaking in Gaelic, rapid, practiced, with the kind of efficiency that suggests he needs to get through Mass quickly because he has another village to reach before nightfall. The words are familiar even if you don't always understand the theological implications. Invocations to saints, prayers for the dead, requests for divine intervention in matters ranging from crop success to protection from raiders. Historians still argue whether Highland Catholicism in this period was genuinely orthodox or whether it represented a syncretic blend of Catholic ritual and older Celtic religious practices that the Church simply couldn't eliminate. You're definitely seeing evidence of the syncretic approach. Father Callum is blessing the congregation with holy water, but old Moira is simultaneously making hand gestures that predate Christianity by centuries, warding signs against evil spirits that have nothing to do with Catholic theology and everything to do with older beliefs that nobody's quite willing to abandon. The priest sees this, chooses not to comment, and continues with the Mass, because pragmatism is more useful than theological purity when you're ministering to people who live 3 days' walk from the nearest bishop. The prayers shift to requests for protection. Protection from wolves, from English raids, from crop failures, from childhood illnesses, from all the mundane terrors that define Highland life. These are practical prayers, folk petitions to divine powers who are expected to provide tangible assistance rather than abstract spiritual comfort. You're praying for your cattle to survive winter, for your children to not die of fever, for the MacGregors to maybe find someone else to raid this season. God, in this worldview, is less cosmic creator and more powerful patron who might intervene in your favor if you ask politely and make appropriate offerings. Father Callum is conducting communion now, though communion is a generous term when the bread is the same barley cake everyone ate for breakfast and the wine is so watered down it's basically grape-flavored water. The theological point is what matters. Supposedly the transubstantiation, the spiritual transformation, the connection to Christ's sacrifice. In practice, it's a brief moment where everyone gets a small piece of bread and a sip of liquid that tastes better than water but worse than actual wine. People are filing forward, kneeling briefly, receiving their portion. You notice that several villagers are touching the priest's robes as they pass, not aggressively, just brief touches, like making contact with something holy, might transfer blessing through physical proximity. This is probably not Orthodox Catholic practice, but Father Callum allows it because he's learned that Highland spirituality operates on principles that Catholic theology doesn't entirely cover. The Mass concludes faster than you expected, maybe 20 minutes total, which is impressively efficient considering the priest managed to cover sin, salvation, saints, and communal petitions in that time. Father Callum is already packing his liturgical items back into the wooden chest, preparing to move on to the next village on his circuit. But before he leaves, there's business to conduct. Your chieftain steps forward, pressing a small leather pouch into the priest's hand, payment for services rendered, probably containing oats or dried fish or whatever currency travels better than cattle. Father Callum accepts with practiced grace, offers final blessings in Gaelic that invoke saints both officially recognized and suspiciously local. And then he's out the door, already walking toward the next village, where another congregation is probably gathering in another smoky black house. The crowd disperses, everyone returning to their interrupted work. You've been blessed, communed, and reminded of your spiritual obligations in under 30 minutes. Your relationship with God has been renewed through the medium of a traveling priest who's probably conducting the same hasty Mass in another village before sunset. This is Highland Catholicism, pragmatic, syncretic, and efficient out of necessity. Old Moira is muttering prayers to St. Columba as she leaves, but she's also touching the rowan tree outside for protection, because why trust only one supernatural system when you can hedge your bets with both Christian and pre-Christian practices? The priest blessed you. The old gods are presumably still watching. Survival requires covering all available bases. The evening is approaching with that peculiar Highland timing, where you're never quite sure if the dimming light is sunset or just more clouds rolling in, and the men of the village are gathering in the open space between the black houses. Not for another clan meeting, the chieftain isn't present, but for something equally important and considerably more physical, weapons practice. Because living in a region where your nearest neighbours might decide to steal your cattle on any given Tuesday means staying ready to stab people on relatively short notice. You're carrying your dirk, the long knife that every Highland man owns, as naturally as breathing. It's about 12 inches of iron blade with a wooden handle wrapped in leather, sharpened on both sides, and capable of functions ranging from cutting rope to defending your life with remarkable versatility. The dirk lives at your belt during waking hours and under your sleeping platform at night, because the medieval Highlands operate on the principle that violence is always a possibility and being unarmed is being unprepared. Your targe is leaning against the wall of your black house, a circular wooden shield maybe 18 inches across, covered in leather, with a central metal boss that can double as a striking weapon if you get creative. The mainstream historical fact is that the dirk and targe combination was the standard Highland fighting style for centuries, emphasizing close quarters combat, aggressive offense, and the kind of ferocious determination that comes from knowing retreat means losing everything you own. The quirky tidbit that weapons historians love: many Highland targes had a small spike hidden behind the central boss, allowing the shield to function as both defensive and offensive weapon simultaneously. The practice session is informal but serious. There's Angus with his 6 cattle and his insufferable confidence, paired off against young Hamish, who's maybe 16, and still figuring out that enthusiasm doesn't compensate for experience. The blacksmith Duncan is here, demonstrating why arms like his are useful for more than just hammering metal. He's moving with the kind of controlled power that suggests hitting him would be similar to hitting a stone wall, except the wall would probably be friendlier. You're paired with Fergus, a cousin of some description. Everyone's a cousin in Highland villages where bloodlines tangle like yarn in a basket, and you're both settling into the familiar dance of practice combat. The rules are simple. First blood doesn't count. Serious injury is frowned upon, and if you accidentally kill someone, you'll have to explain to their family why their primary breadwinner is currently bleeding out in the dirt, which is socially awkward at minimum. The dirk feels comfortable in your hand, the weight and balance familiar from years of use. You're circling Fergus, both of you crouch slightly, targes up, looking for openings. This isn't the choreographed sword fighting that Hollywood will eventually convince people looks cool. This is brutal, practical, ugly combat designed to incapacitate opponents as quickly as possible. There are no flourishes, no dramatic poses, just efficiency backed by the knowledge that real fighting means someone's going home injured or not going home at all. Fergus lunges. You block with your targe, feeling the impact vibrate up your arm, and counter with a slash that he barely deflects. The dirks clash with a metallic ring that carries across the village, attracting children who gather to watch men practice violence with the fascinated attention kids give to anything potentially dangerous. Your wife glances over from the black house entrance, sees you're not actively dying, and returns to whatever she was doing. Spousal support in the medieval Highlands involves a certain pragmatic acceptance of risk. Historians still argue whether Highland combat training was formalized or purely practical, whether men learned fighting techniques through structured instruction or simply through necessity and observation. From your perspective, breathing hard as Fergus nearly catches you with a low strike, it's definitely the learn by doing and try not to die school of martial education. You're sweating now despite the cold evening air, muscles protesting the exertion. Practice fighting is exhausting in ways that actual fighting probably is too, except actual fighting comes with the added excitement of genuine mortality risk. Fergus gets past your guard and tags you lightly on the shoulder. If this were real, you'd currently be bleeding and reconsidering your life choices. You acknowledge the hit, reset, continue. The practice intensifies as more men join, creating multiple pairs of fighters circling each other in the gathering darkness. Someone has lit torches because practicing weapons work in complete darkness is how you lose eyes and gain reputations as the village idiot. The flickering firelight makes everything look dramatic and vaguely sinister silhouettes of armed men, the flash of steel, shadows dancing across stone walls. Young Hamish is on the ground now, Angus's dirk at his throat in a gesture that clearly communicates, "You're dead." Hamish looks appropriately humiliated, which is the point humiliation in practice means you might survive when it's real. Angus helps him up with gruff encouragement that translates roughly to, "You fought badly, but at least you're learning," which is Highland for good effort. The chieftain's son is demonstrating a technique he learned from a travelling warrior, some complicated footwork combined with a shield bash that's supposed to create an opening for a killing thrust. It looks impressive until he trips over his own feet and nearly stabs himself, at which point it looks significantly less impressive, and everyone pretends not to have noticed, because laughing at the chieftain's son is politically unwise. You're thinking about the McGregors, about the upcoming raid that your chieftain is planning. These practice sessions aren't just exercise or male bonding, they're preparation for actual violence that will happen on an actual night when you'll actually drive someone else's cattle away while they try to actually kill you for it. The dirk in your hand has killed men. Not many, fortunately, because you're sensible enough to avoid fights when possible, but a few. Those memories sit uncomfortably in your mind, the resistance of flesh, the smell of blood, the sounds men make when steel finds vital organs. Your ancestors were warriors, supposedly. The clan bards sing about great battles, heroic last stands, warriors so fierce that enemies fled at the mere sight of them. You're holding the same type of weapons they held, fighting in the same style, maintaining the same traditions. The continuity is both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because you're part of something larger than yourself. Disturbing because that something involves a lot of violent death. The practice continues until darkness makes it genuinely dangerous, and someone, probably the smith's wife, yells that food is ready, and anyone who wants to eat should stop trying to kill each other and come inside. The men disperse, breathing hard, sweating despite the cold, comparing bruises with the camaraderie that comes from shared violence. You're heading home, dirk still at your belt, because you don't undress until you're safely inside. Your muscles are tired, your reflexes are sharp. Your mind is in that peculiar state where the adrenaline of combat practice hasn't quite worn off. Tomorrow the cattle need tending, the water needs fetching, the peat needs cutting. But tonight you practiced war, because war is always coming in the Highlands, if not this week, then next month, if not from the McGregors, then from someone else who wants what you have and has weapons to take it. This is how Highland men spend their evenings, maintaining the skills necessary to defend what little they own against neighbours who are simultaneously allies, enemies, and distant cousins, depending on the political situation and whose cattle need stealing this season. You wake the next morning to the sound of rain hammering on your thatched roof with the enthusiasm of someone who really wants you to know that weather is happening. Not gentle rain, not the soft patter that poets write about. This is Highland rain, the kind that falls sideways, finds every gap in your roof, and generally expresses the opinion that staying dry is for optimists and people who live somewhere sensible like the Mediterranean. The rain has been falling for 3 days now, or maybe 4. Time blurs when your entire existence is defined by varying intensities of wetness and the brief, tantalizing moments when the rain slows to merely heavy instead of biblical. You lie on your heather mattress, listening to water drip through the smoke hole in your roof, the same hole that's supposed to ventilate smoke, but apparently moonlights as an entrance for precipitation, and calculate how long your kale can survive, being essentially underwater before it gives up and dies out of spite. Outside, the world is grey. Not the soft, romantic grey of misty mornings, but the aggressive, hostile grey that suggests the sun has filed for divorce from Scotland and moved somewhere warmer. The fog rolled in yesterday afternoon and hasn't left, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet and turning the entire Highland landscape into a damp, cold mystery where anything beyond arm's reach exists only theoretically. Your crops are drowning. The mainstream historical fact is that Highland agriculture was precarious under the best conditions: thin soil, short growing seasons, unpredictable weather, and became nearly impossible when weather turned actively hostile, which it did approximately 8 months out of every year. The barley you planted in spring is sitting in fields that have transformed into shallow ponds, the grain stalks bent under the weight of water, roots probably rotting in soil so waterlogged that soil is generous and cold mud is more accurate. You're pulling on your plaid, which is damp because everything in your black house is perpetually damp when it rains for days on end, and heading outside to assess the agricultural disaster unfolding in what used to be your fields. The wind hits immediately, not just wind, but Highland wind, the kind that seems personally offended by your existence and determined to remind you that exposure is a legitimate cause of death, even in summer. The barley field is worse than you thought. Water is pooling between the rows, the carefully constructed drainage ditches you dug in spring completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of rain. Each stalk of barley represents hours of work ploughing, sowing, praying to various deities that might influence weather, and watching them drown in real time is like watching your future food security literally wash away. Your neighbour Angus is already in his field, trying to dig new drainage channels with the kind of desperate energy that suggests he's also calculating winter food supplies and coming up with numbers that don't inspire confidence. You join him because this is communal crisis and communal labour, grabbing a spade and attacking the waterlogged soil with vigour that's probably excessive but feels necessary. The quirky tidbit that agricultural historians find darkly amusing: Highland farmers in this period had no real weather prediction tools beyond look at the sky and guess, leading to planting decisions based on tradition, superstition, and pure optimism. If your grandfather planted on the full moon in late April, you planted on the full moon in late April, even if that particular April featured rain that would make Noah start checking his Ark blueprints. The soil here is terrible, even when it's not actively trying to drown your crops. It's thin, maybe 6 inches of actual topsoil before you hit rock or clay, acidic from the peat decomposition, and nutrient poor because glaciers scraped away the good stuff 10,000 years ago and nobody's bothered to replace it. Historians still argue whether Highland soil quality improved or degraded during the medieval period through agricultural practices, but from your perspective, currently standing in mud up to your ankles, the soil has always been terrible and will continue being terrible until the next ice age resets everything. You're digging furiously, trying to create channels that will drain water away from the barley, but the rain keeps falling and the channels keep filling, and the whole enterprise has that Sisyphean quality where success is temporary and failure is inevitable. Your back is screaming protests. Your hands are raw from the spade handle. Water is running down your neck under your plaid because Highland rain is impressively good at finding any opening in your clothing and exploiting it. The wind shifts, and suddenly rain is hitting you from a completely different direction because Highland weather operates on chaos theory and personal vendetta. You can barely see Angus 10 feet away through the combination of rain and fog, just a vague human-shaped shadow also engaged in futile combat with meteorology. Someone's shouting in the distance, probably another neighbour discovering their crops are also drowning, and the shout is immediately swallowed by wind and rain and the general atmospheric hostility. Your kale is surviving better than the barley, which makes sense because kale is apparently indestructible and thrives on adversity. The turnips are questionable. They don't like being waterlogged, but they're stubborn enough that they might survive out of sheer vegetable determination. The oats are probably fine because oats were specifically designed by some vindictive agricultural deity to grow in conditions that would kill everything else. You're thinking about the coming winter as you dig. If the barley drowns, you lose your primary grain crop. No barley means no bread, no porridge backup when the oats run out, and no grain for brewing ale, which might seem like a luxury concern, but is actually critical when ale is safer to drink than water, and also the only thing making Highland winters psychologically bearable. The rain intensifies, which you didn't think was possible, but the Highland weather has apparently decided to prove you wrong. Visibility drops to maybe 5 feet. You can hear the burn in the distance, probably swollen to twice its normal size, rushing down from the hills with the kind of enthusiasm that suggests flash flooding is on today's agenda. Your boots are full of water. Your plaid is soaked through. You've achieved a level of wetness where additional rain makes no meaningful difference because you've reached maximum saturation. Hours pass in a blur of digging, wind, rain, and occasionally stopping to wipe water from your eyes so you can see where you're digging. The drainage channels are helping. Slightly water is flowing away from the barley at least, but you're losing the war even if you're winning minor tactical victories. The crops will survive or they won't. Your labour might make a difference, or it might be completely pointless. This is Highland agriculture, throwing effort at problems that weather might solve or might make catastrophically worse, based on factors entirely beyond your control. Eventually, exhausted and soaked, and coming to terms with your complete lack of authority over atmospheric conditions, you abandon the field and head home. Your wife takes one look at you, a human-shaped puddle of misery and determination, and wordlessly hands you a piece of cloth to dry off with, though dry is optimistic when the cloth itself is slightly damp from ambient moisture. This is your life. This is Highland weather. Rain, wind, fog, cold, and the constant struggle to grow food in conditions that seem specifically designed to make agriculture as difficult as possible, while still remaining technically feasible. Tomorrow you'll check the fields again. Tomorrow the rain might stop. Tomorrow the sun might appear and remind you that warmth exists as a concept if not as a current reality. Or tomorrow it might rain for another 4 days, and your barley will drown, and winter will arrive with food supplies that inspire anxiety rather than confidence. Welcome to farming in the medieval Scottish Highlands, where weather is cruel, crops are uncertain, and optimism is the only resource more renewable than rain. The rain has finally stopped after what feels like geological timescales, and autumn has arrived with that crisp edge to the air that signals winter is coming and you'd better prepare or die trying. Which brings you to today's activity: butchering livestock before the cold arrives in earnest, because feeding cattle through a Highland winter requires resources you don't have and optimism you can't afford. Your family is slaughtering one of the 4 cattle today. Not because you want to, you've spent months keeping this animal alive, feeding it, protecting it from wolves and raiders, but because mathematics is cruel, and 1 cow eaten in autumn means 3 cows that might survive until spring. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Highland communities conducted annual autumn slaughters out of necessity, culling livestock populations to match available winter fodder, while simultaneously creating preserved meat supplies for the lean months ahead. The cow knows something is wrong. Animals always know. She's making uneasy sounds as you lead her away from the other cattle, her eyes rolling in that way that suggests she's aware this walk ends differently than her usual trips to pasture. You're trying not to think about it too much. Sentimentality is a luxury for people whose survival doesn't depend on converting living animals into calories. Duncan the blacksmith is here because killing a cow requires expertise and sharp tools, and Duncan has both. He's sharpening his knives on a whetstone, the scraping sound setting your teeth on edge, preparing blades that need to be sharp enough to cut through hide, muscle, and bone with minimal suffering. Quick is better. Quick is humane. Or as humane as killing gets when you're about to turn a living creature into winter food supplies. Your wife has the salt-ready precious, expensive salt that you've been hoarding for exactly this purpose. The quirky tidbit that preservationists find fascinating. Salt was so valuable in medieval Scotland that it often served as currency, with families measuring wealth partially in how much salt they could store for meat preservation. You're looking at maybe 10 pounds of salt, acquired through trade, barter, and probably some arrangements you'd rather not think about too carefully. The actual killing happens quickly. Duncan knows what he's doing, a swift cut to the major blood vessels, and the cow drops faster than you expected, her legs folding as blood pumps out in rhythmic spurts that steam in the cold air. You're holding a wooden bucket underneath, catching the blood because nothing goes to waste. Not even the fluid that's currently draining from a dying animal. The blood is warm against the bucket's sides, darker than you expected, and smells metallic and organic in ways that are both disturbing and somehow natural. This blood will become black pudding blood, mixed with oats and fat, stuffed into intestines, and cooked into something that's actually edible if you don't think too hard about the ingredients. Historians still argue whether blood pudding was primarily a poverty food or a genuine delicacy in medieval Highland cuisine, but from your perspective, it's protein and calories in a form that stores well and doesn't require refrigeration that won't be invented for centuries. Duncan is already working on the hide, making careful cuts that separate skin from flesh without damaging either. The hide is valuable, it'll be scraped, treated, and eventually become leather for shoes, bags, or repairs to equipment that's falling apart from use. Your oldest child is watching with fascinated horror, learning the practical anatomy that comes from dismantling something that was recently alive. The internal organs come out in a steaming mass stomach, intestines, liver, heart, kidneys, and each one gets sorted into definitely using this versus probably using this versus feeding this to the dogs. The liver goes into the definitely pile because liver is nutritious, even if it tastes like the cow's regrets. The intestines will be cleaned extensively, thoroughly cleaned and used as casings for the blood pudding and whatever other preserved meats you can manage. Your wife is already working on the first chunks of meat, cutting them into strips, maybe 2 inches wide and a foot long. These strips get rubbed thoroughly with salt, more salt than seems reasonable, a coating so thick it looks like snow before being packed into wooden barrels where they'll cure for weeks. The salt draws out moisture, prevents bacterial growth, and transforms fresh meat into something that can survive months without spoiling, though survive might be generous given that salt-preserved meat has roughly the texture of shoe leather and requires soaking before it's even theoretically edible. The fat gets rendered separately, heated over the fire until it melts into tallow that will serve as both cooking fat and candle material. Nothing goes to waste, that's the rule, the law, the survival strategy. Bones will be boiled for broth, then crushed for marrow, then possibly ground into meal for the pigs. Tendons become binding material. Even the hooves get boiled down for glue. You're working on the ribs now, separating them from the spine with a saw that Duncan brought specifically for this purpose. The physical labor is intense. Cutting through bone and cartilage requires force and patience, and you're sweating despite the autumn cold. Your hands are covered in blood and fat, slippery and cold, and the smell of raw meat is overwhelming in that way that makes you simultaneously hungry and slightly nauseated. The children are helping where they can, mostly carrying buckets and holding things steady while adults do the actual cutting. Your youngest is playing with the cow's tail, slightly disturbing but also age-appropriate curiosity about the anatomy of something they've seen alive every day for months. Death education. Highland style. Hands-on, practical, and completely unavoidable when survival requires understanding where food actually comes from. Old Moira has appeared with herbs, rosemary, thyme, whatever grows in her garden, and supposedly helps preserve meat beyond just the salt. Whether the herbs actually do anything or just make the meat taste slightly less like pure salt is debatable, but tradition says use herbs, so herbs get used. She's muttering prayers or possibly charms while sprinkling vegetation over the meat, and nobody questions it because covering all available supernatural bases seems wise when you're trying to make food last through winter. The slaughter and processing takes all day. The sun is setting by the time you've reduced one living cow into compartmentalized products: salted meat in barrels, blood pudding hung to dry, tallow rendered and stored, hide scraped and stretched, bones stacked for later processing. Where there was one cow, there's now winter survival packed into containers and preservation methods that humanity's been using since someone figured out that salt does useful things to meat. You're exhausted, covered in blood and fat and bits of tissue you'd rather not identify, standing in the gathering darkness, looking at the results of turning a living animal into resources. Your 3 remaining cattle are watching from their enclosure, probably calculating their odds of surviving until spring without becoming tomorrow's butchering project. This is autumn in the medieval Highlands. Slaughter, preservation, and the pragmatic conversion of livestock into calories that might keep you alive when winter arrives in full force, and fresh food becomes a fond memory. You've washed the blood off your hands with cold water from the burn washed, being optimistic, when you're basically just redistributing the blood into a thinner layer and changed into your slightly less disgusting tunic. And now you're heading toward the chieftain's black house, where the evening gathering is already underway. Because after a day of butchering livestock and contemplating winter mortality, what you really need is ale and human company, preferably in that order. The chieftain's black house is the largest in the village, which means it can fit maybe 30 people if everyone breathes shallowly and accepts that personal space is a luxury for lowlanders and people with architectural ambitions. You duck through the doorway. The entrance is low enough that even Highland height people need to crouch slightly, which keeps out cold air and reminds everyone that humility begins with hitting your head on door frames. Inside, the fire is roaring with unusual enthusiasm. Fed with peat, someone deemed worthy of burning for communal warmth rather than individual survival. The smoke is thick enough to make your eyes water immediately, but you're so accustomed to smoke that clear air would probably feel wrong, like something essential was missing from the atmosphere. The mainstream historical fact is that communal evening gatherings were central to Highland social life, serving as news exchange, entertainment venue, dispute resolution forum, and the only activity available after dark, when going outside, meant navigating total darkness while wolves were potentially interested in your continued existence. The ale is flowing already, passed around in wooden cups that multiple people have drunk from, and nobody's particularly worried about because germ theory won't be invented for centuries. And what you don't know can't hurt you, or it can, but you'll blame it on curses instead of microorganisms. The ale is weak by modern standards, maybe 3% alcohol, but it's wet, it tastes better than water, and after a day of converting cattle into preserved meat, even weak ale feels like divine intervention in liquid form. You find a spot on the floor near the fire, wedging yourself between Angus and his endless cattle boasts, and young Hamish, who's still sporting bruises from weapons practice and probably planning revenge against everyone who beat him. The room is filled with that particular sound of humans being social, overlapping conversations in Gaelic, occasional laughter, someone's baby crying in the corner, and the constant background crackle of the peat fire. The chieftain is holding court from his position near the fire, describing the upcoming cattle raid against the MacGregors with the enthusiasm of someone planning a particularly exciting vacation rather than organised theft that could easily result in people dying. He's gesturing with his cup of ale, definitely stronger ale than what you're drinking, because hierarchy applies to alcohol content too, explaining the raid strategy with military precision that would impress actual military strategists if any were present, which they aren't. Someone asks about the weather, and suddenly everyone has opinions. The rain was terrible. No, it was catastrophic. Actually, it wasn't as bad as the rain 3 years ago when the entire barley crop drowned and people had to eat their seed grain to survive winter. Historians still argue whether medieval people accurately remembered past weather events or whether memory exaggerated every previous disaster, making current problems seem manageable by comparison. Your money is on exaggeration, because old Moira claims the rain during her childhood was so intense that fish swam through the air, which is either poetic metaphor or complete fabrication. The conversation shifts to today's cattle slaughter, and suddenly you're the center of attention because your family butchered today and everyone wants details. How much meat did you get? How's the salt holding up? Did you save the blood for pudding? You're answering questions with the kind of casual expertise that comes from dismantling livestock. And somewhere in the discussion, the process of turning animals into food becomes oddly social, almost festive, like you're discussing sporting events instead of death and preservation. Your wife has appeared with a basket of barley cakes, fresh from today's baking, and she's distributing them with the kind of casual generosity that will be repaid when someone else bakes and shares. The quirky tidbit that anthropologists find endlessly fascinating. Highland communities operated on complex gift economies, where everything from food to labour to information was shared with the implicit understanding that generosity would be reciprocated eventually, creating social bonds stronger than any formal contract. Duncan the blacksmith is describing some injury he witnessed during another village's weapons practice. Apparently someone lost part of a finger when a dirk slipped during training, which is simultaneously horrifying and also exactly the kind of story that gets people's attention at evening gatherings. The missing finger becomes a cautionary tale, a source of dark humour, and possibly an exaggerated legend, all within the same conversation. The ale cup comes around again, and you take another drink, feeling the pleasant warmth spread through your chest, in that way that alcohol has been providing comfort since humanity figured out that fermented grain does interesting things to your neurochemistry. Someone started singing a Gaelic song about clan battles or lost loves, or possibly both, the melody haunting and repetitive in that way that traditional music gets stuck in your head for days. More people join the singing, creating a rough harmony that fills the black house with sound that competes with the fire's crackling. You're not a great singer, your voice is adequate at best, but you're joining in anyway because communal singing is less about musical quality and more about being part of something larger than your individual existence. The song speaks of warriors and honor and dying gloriously in battle, which is deeply romantic until you remember that dying in battle actually means bleeding out in the mud while someone's dirk is stuck in your intestines. The children are playing in the corner, engaging in some game that involves a lot of shrieking and running in circles, burning off energy before bedtime. The adults mostly ignore them, unless the shrieking reaches levels that suggest actual injury rather than just dramatic play. Parental supervision in medieval Highland contexts involves a lot of benign neglect punctuated by occasional intervention when someone's about to actually die. Old Moira is telling fortunes now, reading someone's palm by firelight and predicting their future with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing nobody can prove her wrong until the future actually arrives. She's predicting marriages, children, good harvests, and long life, which are safe predictions because everyone wants those things, and being vague enough means you're technically correct no matter what happens. The evening continues in this warm, smoky, slightly drunken haze. People are sharing news from other villages. Someone got married, someone died, someone's having a boundary dispute that will probably become a blood feud within 3 generations. The social network updates through oral tradition, gossip elevated to news sharing, information flowing through conversations the way it will eventually flow through newspapers and internet and whatever comes after that. You're feeling the pleasant exhaustion that comes from a day of hard labor followed by ale and warmth and human company. Your spot on the floor is comfortable, or as comfortable as packed dirt can be when you're sitting on it for hours. The fire is warm. The ale is making everything slightly fuzzy in a good way. Your stomach is full of barley cake. This is as close to contentment as Highland life typically allows, not happiness exactly, but satisfaction, comfort, the temporary absence of immediate suffering. This is evening in a medieval Highland village. Ale, fire, stories, songs, and the communal gathering that transforms individual survival into collective resilience. The evening gathering has reached that critical mass of warmth and ale where people are receptive to entertainment, and as if summoned by collective readiness, a figure appears in the doorway that makes everyone straighten slightly despite the drink. The bard has arrived, not Father Callum with his religious obligations, but Alasdair, the storyteller, who travels between villages carrying history, legend, and the genealogical records of half the Highland clans in his head. Alasdair is old, maybe 60, which in medieval Highland terms makes him practically ancient and therefore automatically deserving of respect. He's carrying a small harp, a clarsach, though you wouldn't know that specific term. You just know it as the bard's harp, and he's wearing a plaid that's slightly less mud-stained than everyone else's, suggesting he spends more time sitting and singing than hauling peat and slaughtering cattle. The chieftain immediately offers him the best position near the fire, and someone hands him ale before he even asks. The mainstream historical fact is that bards held special status in Highland society, functioning as historians, entertainers, genealogists, and living repositories of clan identity, in a culture where writing was rare and oral tradition was everything. They memorized hundreds of stories, songs, and family lineages, preserving history through performance in ways that modern people with their written records and digital backups can barely comprehend. The quirky tidbit that historians love: many Highland bards claim to remember genealogies stretching back 20 or 30 generations, which is theoretically impossible, but also represents the cultural importance placed on lineage and ancestry. Alasdair takes a long drink of ale, professional preparation for what's about to be hours of talking and singing, and settles into his position like a king taking a throne. The room quiets. Even the children stop their chaotic playing because interrupting the bard is the kind of social violation that gets you remembered negatively for generations. The fire crackles, smoke swirls. Alasdair begins. He starts with your clan's genealogy, because that's protocol. You don't launch into entertainment without first establishing who everyone is and where they came from. His voice shifts into that particular cadence that bards use, rhythmic and almost musical even when he's not singing, and he begins reciting names. Your chieftain Donald, son of Malcolm, son of Kenneth, son of Angus, son of Donald, son of Lachlan. The names stretch backward through time, each one representing a man who lived and died and passed his bloodline forward, creating the chain that leads to everyone currently sitting in this smoky black house. The genealogy goes back further than seems reasonable, 20 generations, 30. Names that start sounding mythological rather than historical. Ancestors who supposedly fought Vikings, kings who might have been real or might be legendary, warriors so fierce that enemies died from fear alone. Historians still argue where history ends and mythology begins in these oral genealogies, but the bard presents it all with equal conviction, making no distinction between documented history and wishful thinking. You're listening with the kind of attention that comes from knowing this is your history being recited. That Kenneth from 15 generations back, theoretically your ancestor, that battle against the Norsemen, your clan's proud moment, real or imagined. The genealogy functions as both family tree and origin story. grounding everyone present in a narrative larger than their individual lives of cattle herding and turnip eating. The genealogy finally terminates, or rather, reaches so far back that the names become explicitly mythological, connecting your clan to Celtic deities and possibly King Arthur, depending on how generous Alastair is feeling with the mythology, and he transitions smoothly into a song. The harp begins, his fingers plucking strings in a melody that's been passed down for so many generations that nobody remembers who composed it. The song is about a battle. Naturally, Highland songs are either about battles, lost loves, or battles that resulted in lost loves, with occasional detours into drinking songs and songs about how other clans are inferior. This particular song recounts a conflict between your clan and someone. The enemy changes depending on current political tensions, but the heroic deeds remain constant. Warriors charging through mist, swords flashing, blood on heather. The usual romantic violence that makes warfare sound glorious, rather than the muddy, terrifying, intestine-exposing reality you know it actually is. Alastair's voice rises and falls with the melody, dramatic at key moments, softer during the tragic parts, where the hero receives his fatal wound but delivers some final, profound statement about honor. The harp punctuates each verse, creating atmosphere that transforms this smoky black house into something almost magical. You're transported, despite yourself, into the past he's describing or inventing. The line is genuinely unclear. People are swaying slightly, caught in the rhythm. Someone begins humming the melody's counterpoint, and soon half the room is providing backup vocals without conscious decision, just falling into the musical patterns they've heard since childhood. This is communal music in its purest form, not performance where professionals entertain passive audiences, but collective participation where everyone contributes to creating the soundscape. The song concludes with the hero dying gloriously, his final words being some variation of "Remember me and honor our clan," which is essentially the Highland equivalent of like and subscribe. Alastair strums a final chord, lets it fade into silence, and immediately launches into another story without pause, because stopping means losing momentum and possibly sobriety. This story is older, a tale from when the world was young and magic was real, or at least more openly acknowledged. There's a Selkie involved, a seal woman who sheds her skin and becomes human, and a Highland fisherman who steals her skin and forces her to marry him. It's deeply problematic by modern standards, but apparently romantic by medieval Highland standards, and Alastair tells it with the kind of earnest emotion that suggests he believes every supernatural element. The story meanders through complications. The Selkie bears children, grows to love her captor husband despite the whole stealing her skin and trapping her on land thing, but eventually finds her seal skin hidden in the rafters, and must choose between her human family and her seal nature. Spoiler: she chooses the ocean, returning to her people beneath the waves, leaving her human children crying on the shore. It's heartbreaking. Several women in the audience are crying openly. You're feeling uncomfortably emotional despite knowing it's a story that's probably pure fiction, with at best a tenuous connection to actual events. But that's the power of bardic performance, making mythology feel real, making the past feel present, making you care deeply about people who never existed or died centuries ago. Old Moira is nodding along, claiming she once saw a Selkie herself, which adds exactly zero credibility to the story, but reinforces the cultural atmosphere where magic and reality exist on a blurry continuum. Nobody contradicts her. In the Highland worldview, Selkies are just as real as the MacGregors, possibly more reliable than your clan chieftain, and definitely more interesting than turnips. Alastair transitions into teaching mode now, making the younger people in the room recite portions of the genealogy back to him. This is how history survives, through repetition, memorization, and the social pressure of not wanting to be the person who can't remember your own ancestors. Children as young as 6 are reciting names of people who died before their grandparents were born, building the mental structures that will carry clan history forward another generation. The evening is getting late, you can tell by the way the fire has burned down, and the ale has made everyone loose and drowsy. But Alastair has at least 3 more songs in him, possibly 6 if the ale keeps flowing. There's a drinking song about a warrior who could outdrink any MacGregor, a lament for a chieftain who died young, and a rousing tune about cattle raiding that makes theft sound downright noble. You're absorbing it all, the songs, the stories, the genealogies, storing them in your memory alongside the practical knowledge of cattle herding and peat cutting. This is your cultural education, your connection to history, your identity as a member of this clan in this place at this time. When Alastair eventually dies, and at 60, he's living on borrowed time, someone else will need to carry these stories forward, remembering the words, the melodies, the names stretching backward through time. This is how Highland culture survives without books, without written records, without anything except human memory and the bard's voice carrying history forward through the smoke and darkness. The evening is winding down, people drifting toward their respective black houses in various states of ale-induced contentment, and you're walking home with your wife in companionable silence. The silence is companionable now, anyway. When you married her 7 years ago, the silence was awkward, strained, the quiet of two strangers forced together by family arrangements and trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without constant mutual irritation. Your marriage wasn't a love story. The mainstream historical fact is that marriage in medieval Highland society was primarily a strategic alliance between families, arranged by parents to consolidate land, settle disputes, strengthen clan bonds, or achieve any number of practical goals that had exactly nothing to do with romantic attraction. Love, if it developed, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than a prerequisite. You married your wife because your father and her father decided that joining your families made political and economic sense, and your opinion on the matter was solicited approximately never. You were 19, she was 16. You'd seen each other maybe 3 times before the wedding brief encounters at clan gatherings, where you exchanged maybe 5 sentences total, most of them variations on "yes, the weather is terrible," and "no, I haven't seen your cousin's lost cow." Then suddenly you were married, sharing a sleeping platform in your family's black house, expected to produce children and function as a cohesive economic unit, despite being essentially strangers who happen to now be legally and religiously bound together for life. The early years were complicated, not hostile exactly, but not comfortable either. You had different ideas about how to stack peat. Hers was wrong, obviously, until you tried her method and discovered it actually did keep the fire burning more consistently. She had opinions about cattle management that conflicted with everything your father taught you. Her opinions were annoyingly correct about half the time. You both brought expectations from your respective families about how marriages were supposed to function, and those expectations didn't always align. The quirky tidbit that social historians find endlessly fascinating. Many Highland marriages included formal negotiations, not just about dowry and land rights, but about specific daily responsibilities, who would fetch water, who would tend which animals, how household decisions would be made. These weren't romantic contracts, but practical business arrangements, reducing two people's lives to a series of negotiated obligations that would theoretically minimize conflict. Your marriage included an understanding that your wife would control the indoor hearth and food preparation while you managed outdoor work and cattle. Though in practice, the division of labor is more fluid, because survival doesn't respect contractual boundaries. The children helped, weirdly. Not immediately. Your first child's birth was terrifying for both of you, a night of screaming and blood and wondering if childbirth was going to kill your wife before you'd even figured out if you liked each other. But she survived, the baby survived, and suddenly you had a shared project more important than your individual discomfort. Raising children requires coordination, cooperation, and teamwork in ways that forced you to actually communicate beyond the bare minimum. Love came slowly, if love is even the right word for what developed. It's not the passionate romance that bards sing about. You're not going to compare her eyes to stars or write poetry about her beauty. But there's affection now, built from years of shared labor, mutual survival, and the gradual accumulation of private jokes and understood signals that come from knowing someone deeply, even if you didn't choose to know them. She knows you're grumpy before breakfast and need to be left alone with your porridge. You know she gets anxious when the cattle look sick and needs reassurance that doesn't sound condescending. Historians still argue whether medieval Highland marriages were generally happy or whether people simply accepted arranged partnerships as inevitable and found happiness elsewhere. From your experience, it's neither or both. You're not deliriously happy every day, but you're not miserable either. It's comfortable, functional, occasionally affectionate, and sometimes genuinely pleasant. You've built a life together not because of overwhelming passion, but because you're both stubborn enough to make an arranged marriage work. Your wife's family brought a decent dowry, a milk cow, some wool cloth, and her labor, which integrated into your family's resources and theoretically increased your collective wealth. Your family provided shelter and a share of the land, establishing her position within your household and clan. The exchange was documented not in writing but in community memory, witnessed by enough people that backing out would have social consequences worse than just accepting the arrangement. The obligation extends beyond just the two of you. You're responsible to her family, maintaining relationships with her father, her brothers, the extended network of cousins and connections that came with the marriage package. When her brother needed help rebuilding his black house after wind damage, you spent 3 days hauling stones because family obligation overrides personal convenience. When your sister married, your wife helped prepare the wedding feast, weaving bonds between families through labor and participation. Marriage also means navigating your wife's opinions about clan politics, which don't always align with yours. She thinks the upcoming McGregor raid is unnecessarily risky. She's probably right, and has expressed this opinion with the kind of directness that suggests you should listen even if you ultimately can't change your chieftain's decisions. You've learned that she's often correct about risk assessment, having a perspective unclouded by masculine pride and the social pressure to appear brave regardless of actual danger levels. The sleeping platform you share is small, intimate by necessity rather than choice. You've spent thousands of nights next to her, listening to her breathing, feeling her warmth in the Highland cold, existing in the vulnerable state of sleep where pretense is impossible. That forced intimacy created familiarity, and familiarity created not exactly friendship, but partnership. Your teammates in the survival game, relying on each other's strengths, compensating for each other's weaknesses. Sex happened, obviously, given the 3 children, but it's functional rather than passionate most of the time. Another obligation, another aspect of marriage. Occasionally pleasant, but more often just another activity, squeezed between exhausting labor and sleep. The romantic version of Highland life never mentions how tired everyone constantly is, how desire competes with exhaustion and usually loses, how intimacy happens in freezing black houses surrounded by family members and livestock rather than in private chambers with rose petals and poetry. Your wife is pregnant again 4 months along, starting to show, and you're simultaneously pleased. Children are wealth, labor, insurance against dying alone, and anxious pregnancy is dangerous. Childbirth kills women, more mouths to feed when food is already scarce. She's handling it with the same practical determination she applies to everything else, weaving while she can, preparing for the months when she'll be less mobile, organizing the household around the upcoming disruption. You reach your black house, and she's already building up the fire for the night, adding peat with practiced efficiency. You're settling onto the sleeping platform, and she joins you after checking that the children are actually asleep rather than just pretending. The routine is comfortable now, her on one side, you on the other, the children between you, the cattle below, the whole family unit compressed into this small stone structure that's simultaneously cramped and secure. The bard's stories were good tonight, she says quietly, and you agree, and that's the extent of your evening conversation before sleep claims you both. Not romantic, not passionate, just 2 people who've built a life together because their families decided they should, and who've made the best of an arrangement neither chose but both maintain. This is Highland marriage. Practical, obligatory, occasionally affectionate, and fundamentally about survival rather than love. Though sometimes, if you're fortunate, survival and love become the same thing. Your youngest wakes you in the night with coughing, not the gentle clearing throat cough, but the deep, rattling kind that sounds like their lungs are attempting rebellion. You're immediately awake despite the exhaustion, because childhood illness in the medieval Highlands is the kind of thing that starts as a cough and ends as a funeral if you're not careful, and sometimes even if you are. Your wife is already moving, feeling the child's forehead with her hand in the universal parental diagnostic gesture. The fever is there, you can see it in the child's flushed face. Feel the heat radiating from their small body. This is the moment where modern parents would reach for thermometers and children's medicine. But you live in a world where medical intervention means herbal remedies, prayer, and hoping whatever's wrong resolves itself before it becomes fatal. Your wife is already digging through the wooden chest where she keeps her medical supplies, being generous for what's essentially a collection of dried plants, some animal fat, cleanish cloth, and a few items whose purpose you're not entirely clear on, but apparently have healing properties according to generations of Highland women who've been treating illness with determination and limited resources. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Highland medicine was primarily the domain of women, who accumulated knowledge of local plants, healing techniques, and treatments through oral tradition passed from mothers to daughters across generations. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no medical schools, just practical experience, herbal lore, and the understanding that some things worked, some things didn't, and many things fell into the ambiguous category of might help, probably won't hurt, worth trying because the alternative is watching people die. She's pulling out dried coltsfoot leaves, the same plant she mentioned to the other women during spinning, apparently a standard remedy for coughs. The leaves get crumbled into hot water that's been heating over the fire, creating a tea that smells vaguely herbal and deeply unappealing. The quirky tidbit that medical historians find simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. Many medieval Highland remedies actually had legitimate medicinal properties: willow bark containing salicylic acid, aspirin, mouldy bread, providing primitive antibiotics. Certain plants genuinely reducing inflammation, even though the people using them had no understanding of why they worked. Just empirical observation that they sometimes did. Your child is reluctant to drink the coltsfoot tea, which is fair because it tastes like someone dissolved a meadow in hot water and forgot to add anything remotely pleasant. Your wife is coaxing, then insisting, then basically forcing the child to drink because parental authority overrides childhood preferences when health is at stake. The child swallows, makes a face that suggests betrayal and disgust in equal measure, and coughs again with enough violence to make you wince. But tea alone isn't enough. Your wife is preparing a poultice, a mixture of crushed herbs, animal fat, and what looks like moss, heated slightly and spread on a piece of cloth. The poultice goes on the child's chest, warm and presumably therapeutic, though the mechanism of action is generations of Highland women say this works, rather than anything resembling modern medical understanding. The child protests the weird warm plant paste on their chest, but protests are ignored because this is medicine, and medicine in the medieval Highlands isn't optional or pleasant. Old Moira appears in your doorway summoned by maternal networks that operate faster than any communication technology, carrying her own bag of remedies and opinions. She's examining your child with the confidence of someone who's treated approximately 10,000 childhood illnesses and has strong views about which ones are serious versus which ones just require time and stubbornness. Her diagnosis, delivered in Gaelic that brooks no argument, is that the child has caught cold, possibly from playing in the rain. Accurate, you saw them doing exactly that, and needs warmth, rest, and her special honey mixture if you can afford honey, which you probably can't. Historians still argue whether medieval Highland folk medicine was primarily effective or primarily placebo, with modern analysis suggesting an uncomfortable mixture of both. Some remedies had genuine therapeutic value. Others were complete nonsense that worked only because belief is powerful, and sometimes people recover regardless of treatment. The challenge is separating the legitimate medicine from the wishful thinking when your ancestors weren't conducting double-blind controlled studies, just trying things and remembering what seemed to help. Moira is making a charm while she works, muttering words that are part prayer, part incantation, part medical consultation with supernatural forces who might or might not be listening. She's invoking Saint Bridget, who apparently has authority over childhood illnesses, and also making gestures that predate Christianity by centuries, and probably honor older deities whose names have been forgotten or deliberately suppressed by the church. The charm gets tied around your child's neck, a small cloth bundle containing herbs, possibly a stone, definitely some items, whose purpose is more spiritual than medicinal. Your wife doesn't question the charm, neither do you. When your child's health is at stake, you embrace every available intervention, regardless of whether it makes rational sense. Scientific medicine won't exist for centuries. What you have is plants, prayers, and the accumulated wisdom of women who've kept children alive through countless Highland winters, using nothing but determination and herbal knowledge. The child's cough is subsiding slightly, whether from the tea, the poultice, the charm, or simple exhaustion is impossible to determine and ultimately irrelevant. They're breathing easier, settling back into uneasy sleep while your wife keeps watch, ready to intervene again if the fever spikes or the coughing returns with worse intensity. You're lying awake now, listening to your child breathe, calculating the odds of this being minor illness versus the beginning of something fatal. Childhood mortality is high enough that every illness carries weight. Every fever could be the one that doesn't break. Every cough might be the last sound you hear before grief becomes your new permanent companion. But the child sleeps. The poultice stays warm on their chest. The charm hangs around their neck. Old Moira has returned to her black house, satisfied that she's done everything possible with the resources available. Your wife is adding more peat to the fire because warmth is medicine too, maintaining the temperature that might mean the difference between recovery and deterioration. This is Highland medicine, practical, spiritual, desperate, and effective enough that humanity survived to complain about it. Plants become remedies, prayers become treatment, hope becomes strategy. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, sick children wake healthy in the morning, and folk medicine gets credit for what might be luck, resilience, or the human body's own remarkable ability to heal itself given time and rest. Your child's fever breaks sometime before dawn. You can feel the change in their body temperature when you check for the 100th time, the heat receding, their breathing settling into something closer to normal. Relief floods through you, but it's complicated relief, because now a different fear takes hold. What if this wasn't natural illness at all? What if the fairies noticed your child and decided to intervene? The changeling fear is real. Not metaphorically real, not people believed in it real, but viscerally, immediately, keep you awake at night real in a way that modern people struggle to understand. The mainstream historical fact is that changeling beliefs were widespread across medieval Scotland and Ireland, with families genuinely convinced that fairies could and would steal healthy human children, leaving sickly, difficult replacements, changelings, in their place. These beliefs weren't fringe superstition relegated to uneducated peasants. They permeated all levels of Highland society, influencing everything from childcare practices to how families treated children who seemed different. Your wife is already taking precautions. She's moving the iron poker closer to the sleeping platform. Iron is protection against fairy magic. Everyone knows this, the same way everyone knows fire is hot and winter is cold. The poker rests within arm's reach, ready to be grabbed if something supernatural comes calling in the night. She's also checking the rowan wood charm above the doorway, making sure it's securely fastened, because rowan trees have protective properties that fairies supposedly respect, or at least find irritating enough to avoid. The logic goes like this. Fairies want beautiful, healthy human children for reasons that vary depending on who's telling the story. Some say they need human blood to pay their tithe to hell. Others claim fairy children are weak and sickly, so they steal robust human babies as replacements. Still, others suggest fairies just enjoy causing misery because supernatural beings are jerks. When a healthy child suddenly becomes ill, cries constantly, fails to thrive, or develops strange behaviors, the obvious explanation to medieval Highland minds is that the fairies have made a switch. Old Moira told you once about a family 3 villages over who were convinced their child was a changeling. The baby had been healthy, then suddenly became sickly, cried endlessly, refused to feed properly. The family tried everything, prayers, charms, consulting traveling priests before someone suggested the traditional test, put the suspected changeling near fire or threaten it with violence, and if it's truly a fairy replacement, it will reveal its true nature, or the fairies will return the real child to avoid harm to their own. You don't ask what happened to that baby. Some stories don't need endings spelled out. Historians still argue whether changeling beliefs led to the abuse or neglect of children with disabilities, developmental delays, or chronic illnesses, with modern analysis suggesting a deeply uncomfortable relationship between superstition and how medieval communities treated different children. The belief system provided a framework for explaining conditions that medical science couldn't address: autism, cerebral palsy, severe illness, any condition that made a child seem fundamentally changed from their previous self. Your child stirs in their sleep, making small sounds that are normal, healthy, nothing like the changeling stories describe. But you're watching anyway, looking for signs. Are their eyes the same color? Do they recognize you properly? Is their crying normal infant distress or something stranger, more knowing? The paranoia is insidious, creeping into parental observation and turning normal childhood behaviors into potential evidence of supernatural interference. The protective measures extend beyond iron and rowan. Your wife keeps salt near the cradle. Fairies supposedly hate salt the same way they hate iron, though the reasoning differs depending on which old woman is explaining it. She never praises the children too openly or too enthusiastically, because drawing attention to how beautiful or healthy they are might attract fairy interest. Compliments are always tempered. The baby is well enough, instead of the baby is perfect, growing adequately instead of thriving magnificently. The quirky tidbit that folklorists find endlessly fascinating: specific rituals were believed to either prevent changeling theft or force fairies to return a stolen child. These included placing iron scissors under the pillow, turning clothes inside out, baptizing children as quickly as possible. Unbaptized babies were supposedly more vulnerable, never leaving infants alone, and most dramatically threatening suspected changelings with fire or drowning to make the fairies reclaim them. Some rituals were harmless, others were deeply dangerous to actual children. You're watching your youngest sleep now, their small chest rising and falling, fever-flushed face gradually returning to normal color. The fear that gripped you during the illness is transforming into different anxiety. Did this sickness mark them as vulnerable? Did the fairies notice? Should you be taking additional protective measures beyond the iron, rowan, and salt you already employ? Your wife is muttering prayers, Catholic prayers to saints and Mary, but also older invocations that address the good neighbors, never call them fairies directly, that's asking for trouble, and request that they leave your family alone, that they take their attention elsewhere, that they accept the small offerings of milk and bread left outside as payment for non-interference. The night is quiet now except for the normal sounds: fire crackling, cattle shifting below, wind whistling through gaps in the stone walls. But you're listening for other sounds, unexplained footsteps, strange music, the kind of eerie phenomena that supposedly accompany fairy activity. The Highland night is full of sounds that could be wind or could be something else, natural phenomena that transform into supernatural threats when you're already primed for fear. Your oldest child, sleeping nearby, had a period around age 2 where they cried constantly, refused food, and seemed to be wasting away despite all efforts. You remember the whispered conversations, Moira's concerned looks, the suggestion never quite explicit that maybe this wasn't your real child anymore. The crisis passed. The child recovered. But the fear lingered, the doubt that maybe something changed, maybe the fairies took something essential and returned a copy that was close but not quite right. That child is 9 now, healthy, normal, showing no signs of being anything other than fully human. But you remember the fear. You remember contemplating the traditional tests. You remember how close you came to believing that supernatural intervention was more plausible than simple childhood illness running its course. The changeling belief serves a terrible psychological function. It provides an explanation for the inexplicable, a framework for understanding why healthy children suddenly sicken or die or develop conditions that medieval medicine can't address. It's easier, in some ways, to believe the fairies took your real child than to accept that illness and death are random, meaningless, beyond your control or understanding. At least with fairies, there's agency, intention, the possibility of intervention or negotiation. Your wife is finally settling back to sleep, one hand resting protectively on the youngest child, the iron poker within easy reach. The rowan charm sways slightly in the draught from the door. Salt glitters near the cradle in the firelight. Your family is surrounded by protective barriers against threats that may or may not exist, employing defenses that may or may not work, maintaining vigilance against supernatural dangers that feel as immediate and real as hunger, cold, and wolves in the darkness. This is Highland parenting. Loving your children fiercely while fearing they might be stolen, protecting them from both natural and supernatural threats. Never quite certain whether the child sleeping beside you is the same child who was born to you or something else wearing their face. The fear is primal, persistent, and as much a part of childhood as hunger and growth. The fire has burned down to coals, casting barely enough light to see shapes rather than details, and everyone is preparing for sleep with the efficiency of people who've done this routine 10,000 times. Your wife is banking the fire, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night, ensuring that tomorrow morning won't require starting from scratch with flint and tinder, and the kind of frustration that makes you question your life choices before breakfast. The sleeping platform awaits. And awaits is generous language for what's essentially a raised stone shelf covered with heather stuffing that's compressed over years into something with approximately the cushioning properties of dense moss. You've added whatever wool cloth you can spare, old plaids, worn tunics, anything that creates a thin barrier between your body and the heather that wants to poke through and remind you that comfort is a luxury for people with actual mattresses. Your children are already settling in. The youngest between you and your wife, standard positioning because the youngest needs the most warmth and protection. The middle child is on your wife's other side, and the oldest gets the outer edge because 9 years old means you're hardy enough to handle slightly less optimal temperature conditions. This is Sleep Tetris, Highland Edition, fitting 5 human bodies onto a platform designed for maybe 3, maximizing shared body heat, while minimizing the elbows in faces that inevitably result from compressed sleeping arrangements. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Highland families typically slept together on communal platforms with minimal separation between ages or genders, creating sleeping conditions that modern people would find claustrophobically intimate, but which were simply normal when privacy was an impossible luxury, and warmth required bodies pressed together like sardines in human form. Below the platform, the cattle are settling too. You can hear them shifting position. The occasional low sound of bovine contentment or complaint. The rustle of straw that barely qualifies as bedding. The cattle serve multiple functions overnight. They generate heat that rises toward your sleeping platform. Their presence deters wolves who are less likely to attack a structure containing large animals, and their value as wealth means keeping them close reduces theft risk. The downside is the smell manure, animal musk, the earthy scent of cattle who haven't bathed because cattle don't bathe, but you've long since stopped noticing or at least stopped caring. You're lying down now, the heather crunching slightly under your weight, feeling the immediate cold that radiates from the stone walls despite the fire's efforts. The plaid you're wearing serves double duty as both clothing and blanket, wrapped around your body with the practiced efficiency of someone who's maximized warmth from limited materials. Your wife is pressed against your back, not romantically but practically, sharing warmth in the physics-approved method of reducing surface area exposed to cold air. The children are already asleep or pretending to be, which amounts to the same thing when bedtime is non-negotiable and staying awake serves no purpose except annoying your parents. You can feel the youngest's small body radiating fever heat still, though less intensely than earlier, their breathing regular against your wife's chest. The middle child is snoring softly, that gentle child snore that's somehow endearing despite being technically a breathing disorder that won't be diagnosed for centuries. The darkness is complete. Not turn off the lights darkness, but genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. Darkness that comes from having no windows, no artificial light, nothing except the faint glow from banked coals that barely illuminates 3 feet. You've learned to navigate this darkness through memory and touch, knowing where every object in your black house sits, moving through space with confidence that comes from familiarity rather than vision. The sounds of night fill the black house, the wind outside finding every crack and gap in the stone walls and whistling through with commentary on your construction skills. The fire's occasional crackle as a coal shifts. The cattle breathing below, their presence a constant low-frequency rumble. Your oldest child mumbling something in their sleep, probably dreaming about cattle or kale or whatever 9-year-olds dream about in the medieval Highlands. Your body is exhausted from the day's labor hauling water, cutting peat, weapons practice, butchering cattle, attending gatherings, managing sick children. The kind of exhaustion that should mean instant sleep, unconsciousness as soon as horizontal orientation is achieved. But sleep doesn't come immediately because your mind is running through tomorrow's obligations. The cattle need checking. The drainage ditches need maintaining. Duncan mentioned your scythe blade needs sharpening. Your wife needs help with something you've already forgotten but will definitely be reminded about in the morning. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced insomnia or whether physical exhaustion guaranteed sleep regardless of mental state. From your current position, tired to the bone, but mind racing through concerns, you can confirm that exhaustion and insomnia are perfectly compatible conditions that coexist with impressive efficiency. The cold is pressing in from all directions. The stone walls have been absorbing cold all day and are now radiating it back with enthusiasm. The packed earth floor is essentially frozen ground with delusions of being indoor flooring. The only warmth comes from bodies your wife against your back, the children pressed into the family pile, the cattle below generating heat that rises, but never quite enough to counter the aggressive cold from every other direction. You shift slightly, trying to find a position where the heather isn't poking directly into your hip bone, where your arm isn't compressed under body weight, where comfort is at least theoretically achievable. The shifting disturbs your wife, who murmurs something between sleep and waking, automatically adjusting her position to maintain body contact because separating means losing precious warmth. The sleeping platform is crowded in ways that eliminate any concept of personal space. You're constantly aware of other bodies, their warmth, their movements, their breathing, their occasional sleep sounds. The youngest kicks in their sleep, connecting with your ribs. The middle child rolls over, nearly pushing the oldest off the platform edge. Your wife's elbow finds your kidney with the precision of unconscious navigation. This is normal. This is every night. The alternative separate sleeping spaces would require more room, more bedding, more heating resources than your family possesses. Below, one of the cattle shifts, position with a heavy thump, reminding you that your bedroom is also a barn. Your sleeping space exists above livestock. Your entire domestic arrangement would horrify modern housing inspectors and probably violate multiple health codes that won't exist for centuries. But it works. The cattle stay warm and protected. You stay marginally warmer than you would without them. The system is efficient even if it's not pleasant. Your breathing is slowing, the day's exhaustion finally overcoming mental anxiety about tomorrow's work. The children are definitely asleep now. The quality of their breathing changes, becomes deeper, the small sounds of waking consciousness replaced by the absolute stillness of childhood sleep. Your wife's breathing has synchronized with yours in that way married couples' breathing does after years of sleeping pressed together. The wind howls outside, rain starting again, you can hear it drumming on the thatch, finding the weak spots, probably creating new leaks that you'll discover tomorrow when water drips on your face. But inside, the black house is as secure as it gets. Stone walls, thatched roof, banked fire, family together, cattle below, protective charms in place against both natural and supernatural threats. This is sleep in the medieval Highlands. Communal, cold, uncomfortable by modern standards, and absolutely normal by the standards of people who've never known anything different. Your bed is stone and heather and wool and other bodies. Your bedroom is shared with family and livestock. Your comfort is relative, and your rest is earned through exhaustion rather than luxury. But you're settling now. Finally, consciousness fading toward whatever dreams the Highland night provides. Tomorrow brings more labor, more struggles, more survival challenges. But tonight, you're warm enough, sheltered enough, alive enough. In a world where those conditions aren't guaranteed, they count as success. Sleep comes in fragments. Not the deep unconsciousness you'd prefer, but that shallow, restless state where you're vaguely aware of your body, the cold, the discomfort, and your mind won't quite shut off. You drift between waking and sleeping, caught in that liminal space where thoughts become strange and reality blurs with something that might be dreams or might just be exhausted consciousness, processing the day's events. You're thinking about tomorrow, always tomorrow. The mental calculation never stops. Cattle need moving to fresh grazing. The kale needs checking after the rain. That broken fence post near the northern boundary requires attention before the cattle wander into McGregor territory and create an international incident. Your mind is making lists, prioritizing tasks, organizing the next day's labor before the current day has even properly ended. The dreams, when they come, aren't the fantastical adventures that bards describe in their stories. You dream about work. You dream about hauling water, cutting peat, fixing things that broke, preventing things from breaking. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval people's dreams, as recorded in the few sources that mention them, were overwhelmingly mundane, reflecting daily concerns, work anxieties, and survival fears, rather than epic quests or supernatural encounters. Your unconscious mind apparently can't conceive of anything more interesting than the life you're already living. You're walking through tomorrow in your mind. Wake before dawn, stir the fire, check the children for fever, eat whatever breakfast exists, drive the cattle to pasture, return for water hauling duty, help your wife with the endless textile work, attend to the dozen small crises that will inevitably emerge, because Highland life generates crises with impressive regularity. The routine is so familiar it feels like memory rather than prediction, like you've already lived tomorrow and are just reviewing the footage. This is your life. This was your father's life. This will be your children's life. The continuity is both comforting and suffocating. Comforting because you know exactly what to expect. Suffocating because you know exactly what to expect. And it's more grinding labor, stretching indefinitely into a future that looks identical to the present, which looks identical to the past. Progress, as future generations will understand it, doesn't exist in your world. You're not building toward anything, not improving conditions, not expecting life to gradually get easier or more comfortable. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced their lives as stagnant or whether they simply had different concepts of progress, measuring success in survival, family continuity, and maintaining tradition rather than innovation or improvement. You're not thinking in those terms at all. You're just continuing, existing, surviving another day that will be followed by another day essentially identical to it. The seasons turn. Winter will come, brutal and deadly, testing whether your preparations were adequate or whether this is the year your family doesn't make it through to spring. Spring will bring planting, the hopeful period where you commit labor and seed to soil that might or might not produce enough food to justify the investment. Summer brings brief warmth, endless work, the desperate scramble to make hay and tend crops before autumn arrives. Autumn brings slaughter, preservation, preparation for the cycle to begin again. Your grandfather lived this cycle, your great-grandfather before him. Ancestors stretching back into mythology lived variations of the same pattern. Cattle, crops, cold, survival, repeat. Nothing changes except the specific individuals performing the labor. The work remains constant. The struggles remain constant. Even the weather patterns feel eternal, like the Highland rain has been falling in exactly this way since the world began and will continue falling long after you're dead and forgotten. The quirky tidbit that anthropologists find both fascinating and depressing. Analysis of medieval Highland lifespans and health indicators suggests that quality of life didn't meaningfully improve across generations. Your children will face the same challenges you face, with the same limited tools and resources, achieving the same basic survival outcomes. Innovation happens elsewhere, in places with resources and stability, and the luxury of thinking beyond immediate survival needs. You're drifting deeper now, the thoughts becoming looser, less coherent. Images float through your mind. The cattle in tomorrow's mist, your wife's hands spinning endless thread, children playing in mud that will still be there next year and the year after. The chieftain's face during the clan gathering, the bard's voice carrying stories that never quite end because the struggles they describe never end either. Somewhere in your half-dreaming state, you're aware that tomorrow will be hard. The day after will be hard. The rest of your life will be hard in basically the same ways, punctuated by brief moments of adequacy that pass for happiness, when happiness isn't really a concept you've been taught to expect. You'll work until your body fails. Your children will work until their bodies fail. The black house will stand, or it won't, And either way, someone will be living in a black house on this spot, doing basically the same work for basically the same reasons. The wind outside reminds you that nature doesn't care about your exhaustion, your dreams, your hopes, that maybe tomorrow will somehow be different. The rain keeps falling, the cold keeps pressing, the work keeps waiting, and you keep sleeping, restlessly, preparing mentally for another day of grinding labor in a life measured not by progress, but by seasons, survival, and the stubborn continuation of existence against a world that seems designed to make existence as difficult as possible while remaining just barely achievable. But now, as true sleep finally claims you, the edges of consciousness soften and blur. The anxieties about tomorrow drift away like smoke through the roof hole, dissipating into the Highland night. Your breathing deepens, synchronized with your wife's, with the children's, with the ancient rhythm of humans sleeping together for warmth and safety since the first cold nights of our species. The cattle below are settled, their presence a comfort rather than a concern now. The stones of your black house, those thick walls that have sheltered you through countless nights, feel protective rather than confining. The heather beneath you, compressed by years of use, cradles your body with familiar support. This is home. This is safety. This is enough. Outside, the rain continues its eternal conversation with the Highland earth. But it's a distant sound now, soothing rather than threatening. The wind has softened to a murmur. The darkness is complete and welcoming, wrapping around you like the plaid that covers your sleeping family. You're letting go now, releasing the day's concerns, the tomorrow's worries, the endless cycle of labor that defines your waking hours. In sleep, there are no cattle to tend, no water to carry, no peat to cut. In sleep, there's only rest, the body's ancient mechanism for healing, restoring, preparing to face another day. Your children are warm beside you. Your wife's breathing is steady and calm. The fire's coals glow softly in the darkness, a tiny sun that will birth tomorrow's flame. All is as it should be. All is as it has been. All will continue in the way of things, the rhythm of seasons and survival that has sustained your people since the mists of time. And somewhere in this darkened black house, surrounded by stone and family and the patient breathing of cattle, you find what peace is available in a hard world. Not the absence of struggle that will return with dawn, but the temporary refuge of sleep, the nightly gift of rest that makes tomorrow's labor possible. The Highland night holds you gently now. The ancient stones remember 1,000 sleepers before you and will shelter 1,000 after. You are part of something larger than your individual struggles, woven into the fabric of clan and land and the eternal cycle of life in these unforgiving, beautiful hills. Sleep well, rest now. Tomorrow's challenges will wait, the cattle will graze, the work will continue. But tonight, in this moment, you are simply warm enough, safe enough, loved enough. And that is everything. Sweet dreams,